There is a small brass key somewhere in the world. It is unremarkable. The kind of object you could hold in your palm and feel nothing for. The kind of thing that ends up forgotten in a drawer, sliding between old buttons and dead batteries, until one day, someone throws it away without ever knowing what it was. But this key was once the most important object in the world, and almost no one knew it existed. In the final hours before the most famous ship ever built left England forever, there was a man on board whose job had been quietly taken from him. A last-minute reshuffle. A name crossed off a list. He packed his things and walked down the gangway and into the rest of his ordinary life. And without thinking, without malice, without the faintest idea of what he was doing, he carried that key away with him in his coat pocket. It was the key to a small locker, and inside that locker sat the binoculars that belonged to the men in the crow's nest. The lookouts. The two pairs of eyes whose only purpose on the entire ocean was to see what was coming in the dark before it was too late. So when the night finally arrived, the cold, the silence, the black water stretched flat as polished stone in every direction, the men whose job was to see were left to stare into the darkness with nothing but their own bare eyes. And they would have, at most, 37 seconds. Hold on to that number, 37 seconds, because everything you are about to witness, the ambition, the wealth, the dreams crossing an ocean toward a new life, the music, the laughter, the 1,500 human beings who would not live to see the morning, all of it comes down, in the end, to those 37 seconds, and to a key in the wrong pocket, and to the strange, almost unbearable truth that sits beneath this entire story like a stone beneath still water. None of it had to happen, not the way it did. We tend to remember the Titanic as a tragedy of fate. A great ship, a great iceberg, a collision written in the stars. We imagine it as something almost mythological, as if the sea itself had reached up to punish the arrogance of men. And there is truth in that. There is a terrible poetry to it. But the closer you look, the more the poetry dissolves into something far more human and far more haunting. Because the truth is that the Titanic was not destroyed by fate. It was destroyed by 1,000 small decisions, each of them reasonable, each of them defensible, each of them made by people who could not see the shape of what they were building until it was already too late to stop. A missing key, a warning that never reached the bridge, a speed held a little too high for a little too long, a radio operator, exhausted, snapping at a colleague to be quiet. Lifeboats removed because they cluttered the deck and spoiled the view. A second ship, close enough to save almost everyone, that simply turned off its radio and went to sleep. Pull any one of those threads, and the whole night unravels into something else entirely. A near miss, a story no one would ever tell. A ship that arrived in New York on schedule, to a brass band and a cheering crowd, and then slid quietly into the long gray archive of ships that crossed the Atlantic and were forgotten. But that is not what happened. What happened is that all of those threads held, all at once, on the same freezing night in April of 1912, and the result was the single most studied, most mythologized, most haunting maritime disaster in human history. A wound in the collective memory of the modern world that, more than a century later, has still not closed. So before we go any further, I want you to do something difficult. I want you to forget everything you think you know about how this story ends. Because the people we are about to meet did not know. They had no idea. They walked up those gangways with their trunks and their hat boxes and their second-class tickets and their steerage dreams, and not one of them, not the millionaire, not the immigrant, not the captain, not the boy in the engine room shoveling coal into the dark, not one of them believed that anything was wrong. In fact, they believed the opposite. They believed they were standing on the safest thing human beings had ever made. To understand how a ship becomes a coffin, you first have to understand the world that needed it to exist. The year is 1912, but the story really begins a few years earlier, in an age that no longer exists and that we have, in many ways, spent the last century trying to recover. Historians would later give it a name that sounds like a fairy tale. They would call it the Gilded Age, and then the Edwardian summer, and they would speak of it with the particular ache people reserve for things that were beautiful and doomed and did not know it. It was an age that believed in progress the way earlier ages had believed in God, and you have to feel the full weight of that belief to understand what comes next, because it is the engine beneath everything. For 100 years, the machine had been winning. Steam had conquered distance. Steel had conquered stone. The telegraph had collapsed the oceans into a hum of invisible messages, crossing the world in seconds. Cities that had been mud and candlelight within living memory now blazed with electric light. Men who had been born into a world of horses now watched motor cars rattle past their windows and looked up to see, impossibly, machines learning to fly. Everywhere you looked, the limits were falling. The mountains that could not be crossed were being crossed. The diseases that had emptied villages were being named, mapped, defeated. The map itself was filling in, its blank spaces shrinking year by year, until it began to seem, and this is the dangerous part, this is the part that matters, it began to seem that there were no limits at all, that nature was simply a problem the modern age had not yet gotten around to solving. And so the men who built the world began to dream in a particular direction, not just bigger, not just faster, something more than that, something almost spiritual. They began to dream of mastery. There is a phrase that haunts this entire story, and I want to introduce it now, gently, the way it was first spoken. Not as a warning, but as a boast, as a piece of marketing, as an article of faith. Practically unsinkable. You have heard it. Everyone has heard it. It has become a kind of dark joke, a punchline, the thing arrogant men say in films right before disaster strikes. But in 1912, no one was joking. In 1912, the phrase was not absurd. It was, in the most literal engineering sense, almost true. And that is the thing we forget. That is the thing that makes this story so much heavier than a fable about arrogance. They had good reasons to believe it, which is exactly why no one was afraid. The dream did not begin on the ocean. It began, as so many enormous things do, at a dinner table. Picture a grand house in London in the summer of 1907, the kind of house where the silver is heavy and the conversation is heavier. Two men sit across from one another after the plates have been cleared and the brandy has been poured, and the servants have withdrawn to leave the powerful alone with their ambitions. One of them is Lord Peary, who controls a shipyard in Belfast called Harland and Wolff, a place of fire and noise and 40,000 tons of iron, where ships were not so much constructed as summoned into being. The other is a man named J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, and the figure who will follow this story all the way down to its bitter, lingering end. Remember his name. We will come back to him many times, and the last time we come back to him, you will see him very differently than you do now. For now, he is simply a businessman with a wound. Because the White Star Line was losing, its great rival, the Cunard Line, had just unveiled two ships that were rewriting the rules of the Atlantic, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, vessels so fast they tore the speed records to pieces and seized the prize that mattered most in that world, the Blue Riband, the crown for the fastest crossing of the ocean. To the public, Cunard now owned the future, and White Star owned the past. So that evening, over the brandy, Ismay and Peary made a decision that would echo across the next century. They decided not to chase speed. You should sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the quiet hinges on which the whole story turns. They chose not to compete on speed. Cunard could have the records. White Star would compete on something else entirely, something that could not be measured in knots. They would compete on the experience, on scale, on luxury so complete, so overwhelming that a crossing on a White Star ship would not feel like a journey at all. It would feel like a destination, a floating palace, a piece of the most expensive hotel in the world, somehow set adrift upon the sea, carrying its passengers across the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth as though it were nothing more dangerous than a stroll through a garden. They sketched out not one ship, but three, a trio of giants, the Olympic, the Titanic, and a third that would later be called the Britannic. Sister ships, each one larger than anything that had ever floated, each one a declaration to the world that the future did not belong to speed, it belonged to magnificence. And the names, listen to the names they chose: Olympic, Titanic. Names borrowed from Greek myth, from the race of giants who came before the gods, the titans who held up the sky and the sea. Names that did not whisper, names that announced themselves. No one in that room thought about how those same myths end. The Titans, after all, were not the heroes of the story. The Titans lost. The Titans were thrown down into the darkness beneath the world and buried there forever. But that is the kind of thing you only notice afterward. To build a ship like the Titanic, you first have to build the place that can build it. And so, before the keel was ever laid, Harland and Wolff had to remake itself into something monstrous. They tore down old slipways and fused them together. They erected a gantry over the construction site so vast that it became a landmark visible from across the city, a cathedral of steel scaffolding, a skeleton of girders and cranes towering over the rooftops of Belfast. Beneath it, in the open air, the ship would grow rib by rib like the carcass of some enormous prehistoric animal slowly assembling itself out of the ground. And the men. You cannot tell this story honestly without the men. Something like 15,000 workers passed through that shipyard. Most of them were poor. Most of them had never traveled anywhere and never would. They were Belfast men, hard men, men who climbed the gantry in all weather with hot rivets and heavier hammers, who worked in a world without the safety harnesses, or the regulations, or the mercy of any later century. The riveters worked in teams, a man to heat the rivet until it glowed, a man to catch it, a boy to hold it, men to hammer it home, driving more than 3 million rivets into the hull of that one ship by hand, one blow at a time, until the metal sang. It was deafening, brutal, dangerous work. And it was dangerous in the most literal sense, because men died building her. The records of that time are incomplete and imperfect, but the shipyard counted 8 men killed during the construction of the Titanic, and hundreds more injured. Falls from the gantry, crushing accidents, the 1,000 small violences of building something that large by hand. There is an old grim rule of thumb among shipbuilders of that era, a piece of dark folklore, that a great ship demanded a life for every 1,000 pounds of her cost, or for every so many tons of her weight. Superstition mostly, but superstition is just memory wearing a mask. The men who built ships knew, in their bones, that the sea took a price even before a ship had touched the water. So before the Titanic ever met the iceberg, before she ever carried a single paying passenger, the men of Belfast had already paid for her in blood. And here is a small thing, a strange thing, that I cannot stop thinking about. Most of those workers would never set foot on the finished vessel. They built the most luxurious object in the world, the floating palace of the rich, with their own raw hands, the swimming pool, the grand staircase, the gilded dining saloons they would never be permitted to enter. And then they collected their wages and went home to streets where the children sometimes went without shoes. They built a dream they were not invited into. That, too, is part of what the Titanic was. We will see it again. We will see it in the most terrible way imaginable on the last night, when the question of who was permitted into the lifeboats turned out to depend, with a cruelty so clean it almost looks like design, on which deck you had been allowed to sleep on. But I am getting ahead of myself. There was one man who knew the ship better than anyone alive, and of all the figures in this story, he may be the one who breaks your heart the most. So I want you to meet him now, while there is still time, while he is still standing in the noise and the sparks of the shipyard, with a roll of drawings under his arm, and his whole future in front of him. His name was Thomas Andrews. He was the managing director of the shipyard's design department, the nephew of Lord Peary himself, and he was, by every account that survives, an extraordinarily decent human being. He was not the kind of executive who watched a ship being built from behind a desk. He was on the gantry. He was in the boiler rooms. He knew the names of the workers. He climbed through the ship as she grew, tracing every passage, every staircase, every watertight door. until the design of the Titanic existed not only on paper, but inside the mind of one man as completely as the layout of his own home. He loved her. That is the only honest word for it. He loved that ship the way a person loves a thing they have made with their own attention and care. And he wanted her to be perfect. And here is where the story plants a seed it will not let you forget. Because Thomas Andrews wanted things that he did not get, he wanted a double hull running up the sides of the ship, not just along the bottom. He wanted the watertight bulkheads, the great internal walls meant to seal off any flooding, to be built higher, much higher, all the way up the decks, so that water could never spill over the top of one compartment and into the next, like water sloshing over the dividers in an ice cube tray. And he wanted more lifeboats. Many, many more. He lost those arguments. Not to villains, not to fools. He lost them to reasonable men making reasonable trade-offs, to cost, to deck space, to the aesthetics of a passenger ship that was supposed to feel open and elegant, and not cluttered with the grim machinery of disaster. He lost them to the prevailing wisdom of the age, which held that a ship this advanced would never need so many lifeboats, because a ship this advanced would never sink. And even if she somehow began to, she would stay afloat long enough for another ship to come alongside and take the passengers off in a calm and orderly transfer. The lifeboats were not, in the thinking of the time, meant to save everyone at once. They were meant to ferry people from a sinking ship to a rescuing one. It was a beautiful theory. It was, in fact, almost always correct. The ocean was crowded with ships, and a vessel in distress could usually expect help within hours. Almost always. We are going to spend a great deal of the story inside that word. So where did it come from, this faith? This near-religious certainty that the ship could not sink? It was not arrogance pulled from thin air. It was engineering. And to understand the disaster, you have to understand the very thing that made everyone feel so safe. Because the safety and the catastrophe were the same design, seen from two different nights. The hull of the Titanic was divided, along its length, into 16 watertight compartments. Picture the ship in cross-section, sliced into a row of sealed boxes from bow to stern. Between these compartments stood great steel walls, the bulkheads, fitted with heavy doors that could be sealed shut in an instant by a man on the bridge throwing a single switch, slamming closed automatically, isolating any flooding to the compartment where it began. The principle was elegant and, on paper, almost unbeatable. If the hull were torn open and the sea came pouring in, the captain would seal the doors, the water would be trapped inside one or two compartments, and the rest of the ship would remain dry and buoyant. The vessel could be gashed open and still float, riding a little lower in the water, wounded but alive, until help arrived. The builders ran the numbers. The Titanic could stay afloat with any two of her compartments completely flooded. She could survive a collision at the worst possible point, the meeting of two compartments, with both of them open to the sea. She could even, in certain configurations, survive with 3 flooded, or 4. No accident anyone could imagine would breach more than that. A head-on collision would crumple the bow and flood 2, maybe 3 compartments at most. A side-on collision was almost impossible to picture, because what could a ship that size even strike along her side? So the trade magazine of the day, in describing the system, used a phrase that would outlive every single person who read it. They wrote that the ship was, and I will paraphrase it carefully, designed to be effectively unsinkable, practically unsinkable. The qualifier was always there, practically, effectively, but qualifiers are the first thing the human mind throws away. The public did not hear practically. The public heard unsinkable, full stop. And they believed it, because it had been told to them by the smartest men of the most advanced civilization that had ever existed. And why on earth would those men be wrong? There was a flaw. Of course there was a flaw. There is always a flaw. And the flaw is almost always the thing that looked, at the time, like a minor, sensible compromise. The bulkheads, those great dividing walls, did not reach all the way up. They rose only a certain height above the waterline and then stopped. They did not extend to the upper decks, because doing so would have carved the interior of the ship into a maze of sealed rooms, ruining the open and elegant spaces that were the entire point of the vessel. Thomas Andrews had wanted them higher. He was overruled. And so the compartments were not truly sealed boxes at all. They were more like the compartments of an ice cube tray. Walls that hold water beautifully right up until the water rises high enough to spill over the top, and then runs freely from one chamber into the next. In other words, the ship could survive a wound that filled a few compartments. But if enough of them flooded, the bow would tilt down, the water in the forward compartments would climb higher and higher until it crested the bulkheads, and then it would pour backward into the next compartment, and the next, and the next, each one dragging the bow deeper, raising the level higher, accelerating the spill. A cascade, a chain reaction. The ship would, in effect, scoop the ocean into herself, compartment by compartment, like a row of buckets tipping one into another. But it would take an extraordinary wound to start that cascade. It would take something almost impossible. Something that opened not 2 compartments, not 3, not 4, but 5. Something long. Something that ran along the side of the ship, slicing her open below the waterline for hundreds of feet, in exactly the place no engineer had thought to fear. The men who designed her could not imagine such a thing. The sea could. On the 31st of May, 1911, the Titanic touched the water for the first time. It was not a christening in the way you might picture it. The White Star Line did not break a bottle of champagne across the bow. That was a Cunard tradition, and there was an old superstition about it that I will leave you to consider. White Star simply launched their ships in silence, with a roar of machinery and the snap of hydraulic triggers, and 22 tons of soap and tallow smeared across the slipway to ease her into the sea. More than 100,000 people came to watch. They lined the banks of the River Lagan, packed the rooftops, climbed anything that would hold them, because the launch of the largest moving object ever made by human hands was the kind of event you told your grandchildren about. And at the signal, the great hull, not yet a ship, just a bare iron shell, no engines, no funnels, no decks finished, no name even painted on her side, began to move. 883 feet of steel slid down the greased slipway and into the water in just over a minute. Imagine that, a structure longer than 3 city blocks, taller than an 11-story building, moving under its own enormous weight toward the sea, gathering speed, until the river rose up around her in a wall of displaced water and she floated. For the first time in her life, she floated. And a sound went up from 100,000 throats that people who were there remembered for the rest of their lives. She was alive now, or as close to alive as steel ever gets. But she was not finished. A launched hull is just a beginning. For the next 10 months, the Titanic sat at the fitting-out wharf, while thousands of men poured into her empty interior to build the ship inside the ship. The engines, the boilers, the staterooms, the dining saloons, the staircase, the millions of details that would turn an iron shell into a floating world. 29 boilers, 2 reciprocating steam engines, each the size of a house, a 3rd turbine to drive the central propeller, furnaces that would devour 600 tons of coal a day, fed by men shoveling in the dark. And here, while the carpenters and electricians and plumbers swarmed through her, is where another quiet decision was made. A decision about the lifeboats. The Titanic was designed with the davits, the great curved arms that lower lifeboats over the side, capable of handling far more boats than she would ultimately carry. The original concept could have held space for nearly twice the number. There were sketches, proposals, the possibility of a ship ringed with enough lifeboats to hold every soul aboard. But that many lifeboats would clutter the promenade decks. They would block the views the first-class passengers had paid so dearly for. They would suggest, simply by their presence, that the ship was the kind of thing that might one day need them. And what message did that send on a vessel sold to the world as unsinkable? And there was the law. The regulations governing how many lifeboats a ship must carry were decades out of date. They had been written for a different era, for ships a fraction of the Titanic's size, and they calculated the required number of boats not by the number of people aboard, but by the tonnage of the vessel. By that ancient arithmetic, the Titanic was required to carry lifeboats for around 1,000 people. She would be carrying more than 2,200. So the White Star Line, looking at the books and the decks and the law and the marketing, made a choice that was, by the standards of 1912, entirely legal, entirely ordinary, and entirely defensible. They equipped the Titanic with 20 lifeboats, 4 more than the regulations demanded. They could, in fact, congratulate themselves on exceeding the law. 20 lifeboats, capacity for about 1,178 people. On the night she sailed, there would be more than 2,200 souls aboard. Do that subtraction. Hold it. Even if every lifeboat had launched perfectly full, in calm conditions, with perfect discipline and perfect timing, even in the best imaginable version of the worst imaginable night, there were over 1,000 people for whom no place existed. Not because of panic, not because of cowardice, not because of any failure on the night itself. The people who would die in the water had already been condemned, in a sense, months earlier, in a quiet office, by men adjusting a ledger and looking at a deck plan, who never for one moment believed that any of it would matter. Because the boats were never meant to save everyone. They were meant to be a formality, a reassurance, a row of small white promises that no one would ever have to keep. By the spring of 1912, she was ready, and to step aboard the finished Titanic was to step into something that had never existed before and, in a sense, has never quite existed since. Not just a ship, a world, a floating cross-section of an entire civilization, with all its beauty and all its brutal divisions sealed inside one steel hull and sent out across the cold. Let me take you up through her, because the way she was built tells you everything about the way she would die. At the very top, on the boat deck and the decks just below it, lived the first class. And what lived there does not really translate into modern words, because we have grown used to a world where luxury is available in some diluted form to almost anyone. In 1912, the gulf was absolute. The first-class passenger on the Titanic moved through a level of splendor designed to make them forget, completely and at every moment, that they were at sea at all. There was a grand staircase, and even now, more than a century later, the photographs of it can stop you cold. Sweeping oak banisters, a wrought iron and glass dome overhead that flooded the whole space with soft daylight, a carved clock at the landing, framed by 2 bronze figures depicting honor and glory crowning time. Passengers descended that staircase in evening dress to dine beneath chandeliers, in a dining saloon that could seat over 500 people in a single sitting, the largest room ever to go to sea. There was a swimming pool, heated, one of the first ever installed on a ship. There was a Turkish bath tiled in blue and green like something out of a sultan's palace. There was a gymnasium with mechanical horses and mechanical camels and a rowing machine where passengers could exercise under the supervision of an instructor in crisp white flannels. There was a squash court, a dark room for photographers, a library, a barber, a hospital. There was the Café Parisien, made to look like a sidewalk cafe in France, with ivy on trellises and wicker chairs, where the young and the wealthy lingered over coffee as the most dangerous ocean on Earth slid past the windows. You could, on the Titanic, order a meal of 10 courses and never see the same dish twice in a week. You could send a telegram from the middle of the Atlantic. You could sleep in a stateroom paneled in mahogany, with a private bathroom and a sitting room, and a personal steward who learned your name and your habits and your preferences before you had finished your first morning coffee. The most expensive suites cost, in the money of the day, more than a crewman would earn in several years of labor, more, in fact, than many of the people in the lower decks would earn in a decade. Keep climbing down, though, because the Titanic did not stop at the first class. The Titanic went deeper. Below the gilded decks lived the second class, and here is something worth pausing on, because the second class of the Titanic was, by the standards of its time, a kind of small miracle. The second-class accommodations on this one ship rivaled the first-class accommodations on most other ships afloat. Comfortable cabins, a handsome dining saloon, a library, a smoking room. These were the people in the middle: teachers, clergymen, engineers, shopkeepers, the rising professional class of a changing world. People who had worked their way up to a comfort their parents could never have dreamed of, and who boarded the Titanic with the quiet pride of those who have earned their place. And then, below them, down where the daylight no longer reached, lived the third class, steerage. And it is here, in the lowest inhabited decks of the ship, that the true beating heart of the Titanic lived. Because the third class was not made up of the poor coming for a holiday. The third class was made up of the poor coming for a life. They were emigrants, more than 700 of them. Irish farmers leaving land that could no longer feed them. Swedes and Finns and Norwegians fleeing the long, dark winters of the north. Lebanese and Syrian families crossing half the world. Italians, Croatians, Bulgarians, the displaced and the hopeful from a dozen nations. All of them pointed in the same direction. All of them carrying the same impossible, fragile thing in their chests: America. To them, the Titanic was not a floating palace. It was a bridge, a passage between the life they had and the life they prayed for. They had sold what they owned, said goodbye to people they would likely never see again, and gathered up their children and their few possessions to make the one great gamble of their entire lives: the crossing. The new world was waiting on the far side of that ocean, with its promise that a person could become anyone, that the accident of your birth need not be the whole of your fate. Their accommodations were plain, but by the brutal standards of emigrant travel, almost generous. Clean bunks, decent food, a general room where they gathered in the evenings to sing and play music in a tangle of languages, a public space full of the laughter of children who had never traveled anywhere and now found themselves on the largest moving thing in the world. But their world was below, down in the depths, behind a system of gates and passages and locked doors. Gates that existed for a bureaucratic reason, a requirement of immigration law that demanded steerage passengers be kept separate from the upper classes for health inspections on arrival. Ordinary gates, sensible gates, the kind of thing no one thinks about. Until the night the ship begins to fill with water, and the only way up to the boats, the only way to the light, to the air, to the lifeboats high on the top deck, runs through that labyrinth of corridors, up those narrow stairs, past those gates, in the dark, in a language half of them could not read, with the floor tilting beneath their feet. We will come back to those gates. I promise you, we will come back to them. And it will be one of the hardest moments of this entire story. But for now, the gates are just gates, and the ship is just a ship, sitting at the dock, gleaming and new, waiting for the people who will become her passengers to come walking up the gangways with their hopes in their hands. Every ship needs a captain, and the man chosen to command the Titanic on her maiden voyage was not chosen by accident. He was the most senior, most trusted, most beloved captain in the entire White Star fleet. His name was Edward John Smith, and the passengers adored him. He was 62 years old, a broad and white-bearded figure who looked exactly the way a sea captain is supposed to look: calm, grandfatherly, utterly unflappable, a man who seemed to carry the steadiness of the ocean itself inside him. He had been at sea for nearly 40 years. He had commanded the great White Star liners for decades. He was so popular among the wealthy that certain passengers would arrange their crossing specifically to sail under his command. They called him, with affection, the millionaire's captain. And here is the detail that makes him impossible to forget. The voyage of the Titanic was meant to be his last. He was going to retire. After a lifetime on the water, after carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers safely across the Atlantic without serious incident, Edward Smith intended to step down after this one final crossing. The maiden voyage of the greatest ship ever built was to be the crowning glory at the end of a long and honorable career. One perfect journey, and then a quiet retirement, the sea behind him at last. Years earlier, Smith had said something that would later sound like prophecy and irony braided together so tightly you cannot pull them apart. Speaking of his long career, he had remarked that he could not imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding, he said, had gone beyond that. He could not, he admitted, conceive of any disaster happening to a vessel like the ones he commanded. He was not a foolish man. He was an experienced one. And that is precisely the point. The certainty that doomed the Titanic was not the certainty of fools. It was the hard-won confidence of the most capable men of the age, men who had spent their entire lives being right. Beneath Captain Smith stood a hierarchy of officers, each of them competent, each of them about to face a night that no training in the world could have prepared them for. The first officer, William Murdoch, remember him. In 37 seconds, his name will mean everything. The second officer, Charles Lightoller, who would survive the night in a way so improbable it almost defies belief, and who would carry the story of it for the rest of his life. A bridge full of capable men, all of them about to make split-second decisions that historians and engineers would debate for the next 100 years. And far below all of them, in the bottom of the ship, lived a different kind of crew entirely. The men of the engine and boiler rooms, the trimmers and the firemen and the greasers. Hundreds of them, working in shifts in a hell of heat and coal dust and roaring furnaces, shoveling that 600 tons of coal a day into the boilers that drove the great ship forward. They never saw the grand staircase. They never tasted the 10-course dinners. They worked in the dark, at the very bottom of the world, in the part of the ship closest to the keel and farthest from the boats. When the water came in, it would come to them first, and they would be the ones, in the final hour, holding the lights on, keeping the power running, keeping the wireless alive and the corridors lit so that others could climb toward the boats, staying at their posts in the flooding dark long after they understood that no one was coming down to save them. We do not know all their names. The men who kept the lights burning on the Titanic so that other people could see their way to safety mostly went down with the ship, anonymous, uncounted in the legend that the world would later build. But they were there, in the dark, doing their jobs. And I do not want to tell you this story without telling you that. Now, let me introduce you to some of the people. Not all of them. There were over 2,000, and each one had a whole life, a whole interior world that the ocean would either spare or swallow. But a few. Because the Titanic is not really a story about a ship. The ship is just the stage. The story is about the people who walked onto it, and the impossible choices that a few hours of darkness would force upon them. In the first class, there was John Jacob Astor, at the time one of the richest men in the world, a man whose fortune was so vast it bordered on the abstract. He was returning to America with his new young wife, Madeline, who was pregnant, and who was less than half his age, and whose marriage had caused a small scandal in the gossip columns of New York. They had been traveling abroad in part to let the talk die down. Astor was a hard man for the public to love, a symbol of inherited wealth in an age that was beginning to resent it. Remember that. Because what he did on the last night would change forever the way history remembered him. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, traveling with his valet and, as it happened, with a mistress, which was the kind of thing a man of his means could arrange discreetly. A charming, fashionable man, the sort of man you might never expect to behave nobly. Hold that thought too. There were Isidore and Ida Strauss. He was the co-owner of Macy's, the great department store, a former congressman, a man who had built an empire out of selling things to ordinary people. But it was not his wealth that made the Strausses unforgettable. It was their marriage. Isidore and Ida had been together for over 40 years, and by every account they were devoted to one another with a tenderness that people noticed and remarked upon. When they traveled apart, they wrote to each other every single day. They were old now, and they were together, and they were going home. What Ida Strauss said on the boat deck, in the freezing dark, with a place in a lifeboat being held open for her. It is one of the most quietly devastating things any human being has ever said. We will get there. And there was Margaret Brown. History would later christen her the unsinkable Molly Brown, though almost no one called her Molly in her lifetime. She was a self-made woman from Missouri, brassy and warm and rich from a silver strike, the kind of person who did not fit neatly into the rigid social order of the first class, and did not particularly care to. The old money looked down on her. The old money would have reason, before the week was out, to be very glad she was aboard. Because when the worst happened, Margaret Brown would take an oar in her hands and refuse, flatly, furiously refuse, to let the people in her lifeboat row away from the screaming. There was the Countess of Rothes, who would take the tiller of her own lifeboat and steer it through the night while others fell apart. There was a man traveling under a false name, with a woman who was not his wife. There were honeymooners. There were entire families. There was a designer named Thomas Andrews, the man who had built her, traveling with a notebook, watching his ship perform on her maiden voyage, noting every small flaw he wanted to fix, the color of a screw, the position of a coat hook, with the loving, restless eye of a craftsman who could not stop improving the thing he loved. And in the second class and the steerage, there were the people whose names the world would not bother to remember, but whose stories cut just as deep. There was the Goodwin family, Frederick and Augusta Goodwin and their 6 children, traveling in third class, emigrating to America where Frederick had been promised work. 6 children, the youngest was an infant. They had sold everything. They were all going to start again, together, in a new country. Every single member of that family, all 8 of them, would die. The infant's body, recovered later, would become known to the world as the unknown child, and would be buried beneath a headstone that simply mourned a baby no one could name, until, decades later, science finally gave him back his identity. There were the Sage family, 11 of them, also lost entirely. There were young men traveling alone toward jobs in factories and on farms. There were Lebanese families, Swedish brothers, Irish girls in their teens crossing the ocean alone to work as maids for relatives already in New York. There were love stories and gambles and fresh starts and last chances packed into the bottom of the ship, each one a universe. Of the more than 700 people in third class, fewer than 200 would survive. Of the more than 300 children aboard, the vast majority of those who died came from steerage. Almost no first-class children died. Almost no third-class children lived. But I am running ahead again. The ship has not even left yet. Forgive me. It is hard, when you know how it ends, not to keep glancing toward the horizon. The 10th of April, 1912. Southampton, England. A bright spring day, and the Titanic at her berth, towering over the dock, her 4 enormous buff and black funnels reaching into the sky. Though only 3 of those funnels actually carried smoke. The 4th was a fake, a dummy, added purely because 4 funnels looked more powerful, more balanced, more impressive than 3. Even the ship's silhouette was in part a piece of theater. Everything about her was designed to inspire confidence. The passengers came aboard all morning, the first class arriving in motor cars and carriages, their trunks carried up by porters. The second class in their good travel clothes. The third class moving through a separate entrance, through the medical inspections, the long queues, the checking of papers, and the peering into throats and eyes for signs of disease that might get them turned back at the far shore. And at noon, with a blast of her whistle that could be heard for miles, the Titanic let go her moorings and began to move. She had barely begun. She was easing away from the dock, out into the narrow channel, when something happened that the more superstitious among the crew would never forget. As the Titanic moved past the berths, the sheer volume of water she displaced, 883 feet of ship sliding through a confined channel, created a powerful suction. And moored nearby was a smaller liner, the New York. As the Titanic passed, that suction seized the New York like an invisible hand. The mooring ropes holding the smaller ship to the dock snapped, one after another, with cracks like gunshots. The crowd on the dock scattered as the broken ropes whipped through the air, and the stern of the New York began to swing out, dragged by the wake of the giant, swinging directly toward the Titanic's flank. For a few seconds, and they would have been very long seconds, watched by hundreds of horrified faces from the dock, it appeared that the Titanic was about to collide with another ship before she had even left the harbor, before she had even properly begun her maiden voyage. It was avoided. Barely. A quick blast of the Titanic's engines, the prompt action of a nearby tugboat that managed to get a line on the drifting New York, and the gap held. The 2 ships came within about 4 feet of each other, and no closer. A collision was averted, but the people on the dock had seen it. And among sailors, who carry their superstitions the way other people carry their wallets, A near collision at the very start of a maiden voyage is not nothing. It is an omen. A bad start. The kind of thing that makes an old hand glance at the sky and touch the rail and say nothing out loud. The departure was delayed by about an hour while everything was sorted out. And then the Titanic, freed at last, made her way out of Southampton and into the English Channel, on the first leg of a journey she would never complete. She did not sail straight for America. There were 2 stops first. That evening, she crossed to Cherbourg, on the coast of France, to take on more passengers, including some of the wealthiest aboard, the Astors among them, ferried out to the anchored liner in smaller boats called tenders, because Cherbourg's harbor could not accommodate a ship the Titanic's size. The sun was setting as they came aboard, the great ship lit up against the dusk, and to the people watching from the tenders, she must have looked like a small, floating city, blazing with electric light, impossibly large, impossibly bright, riding on the dark water. Then, the next day, she crossed to Queenstown, on the southern coast of Ireland, the town now called Cove. This was the last stop, the final port. From here, she would turn west and run for New York across the open Atlantic, more than 2,500 miles of cold gray water. At Queenstown, the last of the passengers came aboard, many of them Irish emigrants in third class, young men and women leaving their country, in many cases forever, to seek the work and the life that Ireland could not give them. They came out on the tenders with their bundles and their trunks and their farewells still wet on their faces. They climbed up into the great ship, and some of them, the ones who survived, would describe the strange feeling of standing at the rail as the Titanic got underway again, watching the green hills of Ireland slide backward and shrink and finally dissolve into the haze of the horizon. For most of them, it was the last time they would ever see their homeland. For more than half of them, it was the last land their eyes would ever rest upon at all. There is a photograph from those final days. A priest named Francis Brown had boarded at Southampton and traveled as far as Queenstown, taking pictures all the while. Pictures of the passengers, the decks, the children playing, the ordinary luminous life of the ship. At Queenstown he disembarked. He had been invited by a wealthy passenger to continue the journey all the way to America, all expenses paid, and he had wired his superior in the church for permission. The reply came back. It was, in essence, 4 words. Get off that ship. Father Brown got off the ship. His superior, with no way of knowing what he had just done, had saved his life. And the photographs Brown carried down the gangway at Queenstown became some of the last images ever taken aboard the Titanic. A record of a world in its final, unsuspecting hours, when everyone aboard still believed, with total and reasonable confidence, that they were going home. As Ireland faded behind her, the Titanic turned her bow toward the open ocean and worked up toward her cruising speed. Ahead lay the North Atlantic, and somewhere out there, far to the west, drifting silently south through waters it had wandered for years, was a single mountain of ancient ice that had broken away from a glacier in Greenland a long, long time ago, and had been traveling all this while toward an appointment that no one on board could possibly have imagined. The ship and the iceberg were now, for the first time, moving toward the same point on the surface of the Earth. It would take them 4 days to arrive. The first days of the crossing were, by every account, close to perfect. The weather was fine, the sea was smooth. The Titanic settled into the deep rhythm of an ocean liner underway. The faint, constant tremor of the engines felt through the soles of the feet, the hiss of the bow wave, the long days that ocean travel stretches out into something almost timeless. The passengers fell into the routines of the voyage, promenades on the open decks, bundled against the cold that grew sharper each day as the ship pushed north and west. Long lunches, card games, the gymnasium and the squash court and the swimming pool, the band playing in the lounges in the afternoons and evenings, the music drifting through the warm, gilded rooms while the cold, dark ocean rolled by outside. In the smoking rooms, the men talked business and politics and watched the ship's daily run posted each day, the distance covered in the previous 24 hours, with the keen interest of people who had wagered money on it. Because there was a small pool, a bet, on how far the ship would travel each day, and the figures were climbing. The Titanic was finding her stride. Day by day, the run was getting longer. More boilers were being lit. The ship was going faster. There was talk that would later become one of the central controversies of the entire disaster, argued over in courtrooms on 2 continents, that there was a desire to make the crossing in record-breaking time. Not to beat the speed record outright, the Titanic was not built for that, but to arrive in New York ahead of schedule, to make a splash, to give the maiden voyage a triumphant headline. And the man whose ambition hovered over that possibility was the same man who had sat at that dinner table years before, J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the line, who was aboard for the maiden voyage of his masterpiece, and who would later be accused bitterly, by survivors and by the public and by history, of pressing for more speed. Whether he gave an order or simply created an atmosphere, the effect was the same. The ship was running fast. Faster than was wise, given what lay ahead. And what lay ahead was beginning, by the 4th day, to make itself known. On the 14th of April, 1912, the warnings began to arrive. You have to understand how this worked, because it is one of the most painful parts of the whole story. The way the danger announced itself, again and again, all day long, and was acknowledged, and was filed, and was somehow never quite added up into the single terrifying conclusion it should have produced. The Titanic carried a wireless telegraph, a marvel of the age, the cutting edge of communication, operated by 2 young men named Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. But here is the thing that we, in our connected world, find almost impossible to grasp. The wireless operators on the Titanic did not work for the captain. They were not, strictly, part of the ship's navigation at all. They were employees of the Marconi Company, and their primary job, the thing that paid their wages, the thing that filled their hours, was sending and receiving private telegrams for the wealthy passengers. Think about what that means. The first-class passengers, delighted by the novelty of sending messages from the middle of the ocean, kept the wireless room buried under an avalanche of personal traffic. Greetings to friends in New York, stock orders, dinner reservations for their arrival, idle chatter, paid for by the word, flowing out into the night. And the 2 operators, working in shifts, exhausted, hunched over their crackling equipment, spent the day clearing that backlog of trivial, lucrative messages. The ice warnings came in through the same single channel, and they had to compete. Through the day of the 14th, ship after ship sent the Titanic warnings of ice directly ahead. The Caronia reported ice, the Baltic reported ice and large quantities of field ice, the America reported ice. These warnings did, in various forms, reach the bridge. Captain Smith saw some of them. He even passed one to Ismay, who, by some accounts, casually showed it to other passengers. A curiosity, a talking point. Ice up ahead. How interesting. And then tucked it into his pocket, where it stayed for hours. The warnings described a band of ice lying directly across the Titanic's path, a field of it, stretching for miles, right where she was going. And the response to these warnings was not panic. It was not even much concern. Because again, this was normal. Ships received ice warnings all the time. Ships sailed through regions of ice all the time. The accepted practice, the seamanship of the age, was not to slow down. It was to maintain speed and to post extra lookouts, trusting that a vigilant eye could spot an iceberg in time to steer around it. Captains who slowed down for every ice warning would never keep a schedule, and schedules were everything. The done thing, the brave thing, the professional thing, was to press on and keep your eyes open. So the Titanic pressed on, through a known ice field, at over 22 knots, on a moonless night. And then came the conditions. The terrible, freakish, almost diabolical combination of conditions that came together on the night of the 14th, each of them ordinary on its own, each of them turning, in concert, into a trap. The sea was dead calm, flat, glassy. Not a ripple, not a swell. The kind of stillness that sailors find beautiful and faintly unnerving. And a calm sea, it turns out, is the worst possible sea for spotting an iceberg in the dark. Because the way you see an iceberg at night, before you can make out its shape, is by the white line of surf breaking at its base, the waves slapping against the ice and throwing up foam that catches what little light there is. On a calm sea, there is no surf, there is no white line. The iceberg sits in the black water, with the black water lapping silently against it, showing nothing, betraying nothing. There was no moon. A moonless night on a calm sea in an ice field. The darkness was absolute. The stars were extraordinarily bright. Survivors would speak of that, the brilliance of the stars that night, more stars than they had ever seen. But starlight does not show you an iceberg, and it was getting colder. Bitterly, unusually cold. The temperature was falling toward freezing and below. The crew noted it. The passengers felt it. The decks emptied as the evening wore on, everyone retreating indoors to the warmth. That cold was the breath of the ice field. The ship was sailing into the chill of the very thing that would kill her. Around 7:30 that evening, a warning came in from a ship called the Californian, reporting ice. And then, later, another, the Mesaba, sent a warning describing a large field of pack ice and icebergs lying directly across the Titanic's track, giving the exact coordinates. It was, of all the warnings that day, perhaps the most precise and the most urgent. It is not at all clear that the Mesaba's warning ever reached the bridge. The wireless operator received it, but the operator was alone now, swamped, exhausted, working through that mountain of passenger telegrams that had piled up while the equipment had been down for repairs earlier in the day. The Mesaba warning was not prefixed with the code that would have marked it as urgent traffic for the captain. It may have been set aside, to be dealt with after the paying messages were cleared. It may simply have been laid on the desk and never carried up. We do not know with certainty what became of it. We only know that the single most important warning of the night may have died in a stack of stock quotes and dinner reservations. And then, near 11 o'clock at night, came the last warning. And it is the one that haunts the story most of all. The Californian, the ship that had warned of ice earlier, had a problem. She had run into the ice field herself. Her captain, a cautious man named Stanley Lord, had taken one look at the conditions and made the decision the Titanic did not. He had stopped. He had brought his ship to a halt for the night, to wait out the danger, surrounded by ice, somewhere out there in the dark. And the Californian was close. How close exactly would be argued over for the next century, but she was close enough to matter. Close enough, almost certainly, that she could have made the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. The Californian's lone wireless operator, seeing the great blaze of lights that was the Titanic approaching in the distance, tried to send a friendly, urgent message to the much larger ship. He wanted to tell her what his captain had decided. He tapped out, in essence, "We are stopped, surrounded by ice." The message arrived in Jack Phillips's headphones aboard the Titanic at almost full volume, because the two ships were so near that the signal nearly blew his ears off. And it arrived in the middle of his desperate, hours-long battle to clear the passenger backlog, sending those endless private telegrams to a relay station on the coast of Newfoundland. And Phillips, exhausted, irritated, drowning in work, his ears ringing from the blast of the close signal, tapped back a reply that has echoed down through history as one of the most terrible accidental sentences ever sent. He told the Californian, in the clipped shorthand of the wireless room, to shut up, to keep out. He was busy. He was working Cape Race. The Californian's operator, rebuffed, took off his headphones. His shift was over. He was the only wireless man on his ship, and he had been on duty a long time, and he had been told, rudely, to keep out. So he switched off the set. He went to bed. And with that small, ordinary, entirely human act, a tired man turning off a radio after being snapped at, the Californian went deaf. The one ship near enough to save almost everyone severed the only thread that connected her to the catastrophe that was now, at that exact moment, less than an hour away. Jack Phillips went back to his stock quotes and his greetings to friends in New York. He had no idea what he had just done. He could not have known. Within 90 minutes, he would be sending a very different kind of message into that same darkness, sending it over and over with everything he had, into a night where the one ship that might have answered had already gone to sleep. High above the bridge, in the crow's nest near the top of the forward mast, two men stood watch in the freezing dark. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, lookouts. The two pairs of eyes the entire ship was trusting to see what was coming, and they had no binoculars. There it is, the brass key from the very beginning of this story. The locker on the bridge that held the lookout's binoculars was locked, and the key to that locker was in the pocket of a man who had been removed from the crew at the last minute in Southampton and had walked off the ship carrying it without a thought. The lookouts had asked about the binoculars earlier in the voyage. They had been told the glasses could not be found. So now, on the most dangerous night of the crossing, in a known ice field, on a moonless sea, the men whose only job was to see were straining into the blackness with their naked eyes, their breath freezing on the rail, the cold so deep it ached in the teeth. Would the binoculars have saved the ship? It is one of the great unanswerable questions. Fleet himself, years later, believed they might have given him just enough time. Others have argued that in conditions that dark, binoculars actually narrow your field of view and dim the image, and bare eyes are better for catching the first hint of a shape. We will never know. We only know that on a night when every margin mattered, when the whole disaster came down to a handful of seconds, the lookouts faced the darkness with less than they should have had. At about 20 minutes to midnight, Frederick Fleet saw something. At first it was nothing. A deeper darkness against the dark. A shape on the water directly ahead, growing, and growing fast, too fast, resolving in those last instants into a vast black mass rising out of the sea, taller than the ship's own forecastle, an island of ice the size of a building, dead ahead and rushing toward them. Fleet rang the bell 3 times, the signal for an object directly ahead. He grabbed the telephone that connected the crow's nest to the bridge. The phone seemed to take forever to be answered. When it was, he said the words, "Iceberg, right ahead." On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch had already seen it. He gave his orders in the same breath. Hard a starboard, which, in the helm orders of that era, meant to swing the bow to port, to the left, away from the ice. And to the engine room, the command to reverse the engines, to throw them full astern, to take the way off the ship. And then everyone on that bridge stood frozen, watching the bow, watching the iceberg, willing the great ship to turn. Here is the cruelty of physics. A ship that size does not turn on command. There is a delay, a long, agonizing delay, between the spinning of the helm and the swinging of the bow. The Titanic was traveling at over 20 knots, carrying the momentum of 50,000 tons. The rudder, for a ship of her size, was arguably too small. And so, for several seconds, for the span of a held breath, for the time it takes to read this sentence, nothing happened. The iceberg loomed closer, and the bow held straight, and the men on the bridge watched their own deaths approaching, and could do nothing but wait for the ship to answer her helm. 37 seconds. That is roughly how long passed from the moment Fleet saw the iceberg to the moment of contact. 37 seconds in which the entire future of 2,200 people was decided. And then, slowly, the bow began to swing. The Titanic was turning. For one heartbeat, it looked as though she might just clear it, the bow sliding past the dark mass, the ice passing close along the starboard side. Some of the men on the bridge thought for an instant that they had made it. They had not made it. Below the waterline, where no eye could see, the underwater ridge of the iceberg, the vast hidden bulk of it, the part that gives the iceberg its terrible reputation, 9/10 of its mass submerged in the black water, raked along the starboard side of the ship. Not a head-on collision, not the crumpling impact into the bow that the ship was built to survive. Something far worse. A long, glancing, grinding contact, running back along the hull for nearly 300 feet, buckling the steel plates, springing the seams, popping the rivets, opening a series of narrow wounds along the side of the ship below the waterline. To the people aboard, it was almost nothing. That is the thing that survivors could never quite convey afterward. How gentle it felt. a grinding shudder, a faint jar, a tremble that ran through the ship and then stopped. In the smoking rooms, men barely looked up from their cards. In the staterooms, sleepers stirred and rolled over and slept on. Some passengers felt nothing at all, and only learned later that anything had happened. A few, up on the deck near the bow, saw the iceberg slide past in the dark, towering over the rail, and saw chunks of ice, broken off by the contact, tumbling down onto the forward well deck. And here is one of the small, strange, almost unbearable images from that night. Some of the third-class passengers and a few crew, out on the forward deck where the ice had fallen, picked it up. They threw snowballs of iceberg ice at each other. They laughed. A few carried chunks of it inside as souvenirs to show their friends, joking about the iceberg the great ship had brushed against. They had no idea. For those first few minutes, the collision with the iceberg was a curiosity, an anecdote, a funny thing that had happened on the way to America. Far below them, in the bottom of the ship, the sea was already pouring in. Thomas Andrews was in his cabin, going over plans, when he felt the jar. He knew his ship too well to dismiss it. He went to find out what had happened, and Captain Smith summoned him, and together, the captain and the man who had built her, they went down into the ship to assess the damage. What Andrews found, he understood immediately, with the complete and merciless clarity of the one person aboard who knew exactly what the numbers meant. The iceberg had opened the ship along the starboard side and breached the forward compartments. Water was flooding into the forepeak, into the cargo holds, into the mailroom, where the postal clerks were already fighting a losing battle to drag the registered mail to higher ground, refusing to abandon their post, working in the rising water. Into boiler room number 6, where the firemen had felt the side of the ship cave in and the sea come roaring through, and had run for the watertight door as it began to descend. Into boiler room number 5. Andrews counted. He did the arithmetic in his head, the same arithmetic he had done years before in the design office, only now it was running in reverse, toward a conclusion he did not want to reach. The ship could survive 4 flooded compartments. She could float, wounded, with the first 4 open to the sea. 5 were flooding. 5. One more than she could survive. And it was that 5th compartment, that single fatal increment, that turned a survivable accident into a death sentence. Because once 5 compartments filled, the bow would sink low enough that the water would rise above the top of the bulkheads, those walls that did not reach high enough, and spill backward into the 6th compartment. And the 6th would drag her lower still, and the 7th would flood, and the 8th, the whole horrible cascade that Andrews had warned about, the ice cube tray slowly tipping forward into the sea. There was no stopping it. No pump on Earth could keep pace with the volume of water now entering the ship. There was no patch, no repair, no clever measure that could undo it. The mathematics were absolute, and they were already in motion.
Andrews told the captain the truth, in the flat, quiet voice of a man delivering a verdict he cannot believe he is delivering. The ship was going to sink. It was a mathematical certainty. The only variable left was time. He gave his estimate. An hour. Perhaps 2. No more. Let that settle. The man who had designed the Titanic, who knew her better than any soul alive, who had loved her, was now standing in her flooding corridors telling her captain that she had, at most, 2 hours to live. And he knew something else, something he did not need to say aloud, because the captain could do the same subtraction. There were more than 2,200 people aboard, and there were lifeboats for about 1,178. Even in the best case, even if every boat launched perfectly, full to the brim, in perfect order, more than 1,000 people on that ship were now, in this moment, already beyond saving. The cold equation that had been written into the ship months earlier in a quiet office, when the lifeboats were trimmed from the decks to preserve the view, had just come due, and it was going to be paid in human lives on a freezing night in the middle of the North Atlantic, with the nearest help that was actually listening hours and hours away. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and the passengers roused. He ordered the wireless operators to begin sending the distress call. And then this experienced old captain, this calm, grandfatherly figure on the last voyage of his career, was seen by several witnesses to do something that no one had ever seen him do. He seemed to freeze, to go quiet, to move through the next hours in a kind of daze, giving orders that were sometimes unclear, sometimes contradictory, sometimes not given at all. The most trusted captain in the fleet, faced with the one thing he had said he could not imagine, the one disaster he had spent 40 years believing was impossible. And now it was happening. On his ship, on his final crossing, and there were not nearly enough boats, and there was nothing in all his decades of experience that could tell him how to save 2,000 people with room for 1,000. The ship had perhaps 2 hours. The clock had started. And up on the boat decks, the passengers were only just beginning to come up out of the warmth, in their night clothes and their fur coats, blinking in the cold, asking each other what all the fuss was about, half of them annoyed at being woken, none of them, not yet, not even close, understanding that they were standing on a sinking ship. The hardest thing to make anyone believe in those first crucial minutes was that anything was wrong at all. Think about it from inside their experience. You are on the largest, newest, most luxurious ship in the world. You have been told by everyone, in every brochure and every conversation, that this vessel is as close to unsinkable as human ingenuity can make it. The collision you may have felt was so slight that some people slept straight through it. The ship beneath your feet is steady, level, brilliantly lit, warm, the band still in their quarters, the lights still burning. And now a steward is knocking on your door, asking you to put on a life belt and come up to the freezing boat deck. Of course they did not believe it. Why would they? The whole apparatus of safety, the life belts, the boats, the calm orders of the crew, felt absurd, theatrical, an overreaction. Many passengers, especially in first class, treated the early stages of the evacuation as an inconvenience or even a joke. They came up to the deck, felt the bitter cold, looked at the steady ship and the calm sea and the unhurried crew, and went back inside to wait where it was warm. Some refused to put on the life belts, some refused to get into the boats. Why would anyone trade the warm, brilliantly lit, perfectly steady deck of the Titanic for a tiny open boat dangling 60 feet above a black, freezing ocean? And so, the most catastrophic thing happened in those first vital minutes. The lifeboats, the few precious boats, the only chance for over 1,000 people, began to be lowered half empty. Read that again because it is one of the cruelest facts of the entire night. There were not enough boats to save everyone, and the boats they had, they did not even fill. The very first boat lowered into the water had a capacity of 65 people. It went down with 28 aboard. Another, with room for 40, was lowered with 12. One of the most infamous, the small emergency boat that became known as the money boat, was lowered with only about a dozen people in a craft built for 40, carrying a handful of first-class passengers and crew across an ocean where, very soon, more than 1,000 people would be freezing to death in the water, within reach of the empty seats. Why? A tangle of reasons, each understandable, each fatal. The crew was undertrained for this. There had been no real lifeboat drill. The officers feared, wrongly, that the boats could not bear the weight of a full load while being lowered, so they sent them down half full, intending to fill them from gangway doors lower on the ship. Gangway doors that, in the chaos, were never properly used. The passengers would not get in, because they could not believe they needed to. And above all, in those first 30 or 40 minutes, the ship gave no sign of distress. She sat there, lit and level and serene, and her own calm was the thing that killed the people who trusted it. By the time the danger became undeniable, by the time the bow had visibly settled, by the time the forward deck was awash and the slope underfoot was unmistakable, and the truth had finally cut through the disbelief like cold water through a crack, by then, half the boats were already gone, lowered, pulling away across the dark water, many of them carrying empty seats.
and the people still on the ship looked down at the few remaining boats and the rising sea and finally, fully understood. That is when the night changed. That is when the calm broke. That is when an orderly evacuation, conducted in disbelief, became a desperate scramble for the last places on a ship that was, now visibly, going down by the head. The order given was the old law of the sea: women and children first. But there was no single, consistent way that order was carried out, and the difference in how two officers interpreted it would decide who lived and who died. On the port side of the ship, Second Officer Charles Lightoller took the command in its strictest, most literal sense: women and children only. He would allow no man into a boat while there was a single woman or child anywhere near it, and in some cases, he lowered boats with empty seats rather than let a man take one, even when no more women were waiting at that spot. He held that line with rigid discipline. It was honorable. It was also, in the cold accounting of the night, part of why so many boats went down underfilled. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch, the same Murdoch who had given the orders on the bridge at the moment of impact, read the order differently. Women and children first, yes, but if a boat was being lowered and no women or children were present to fill the empty seats, he would let men step in rather than send the seats down empty. His interpretation was more practical, and as a result, more men survived from the starboard side. Neither man was wrong. Both were doing their duty as they understood it, under impossible pressure, in the dark, while the deck tilted beneath them. But the gap between their two readings of three small words, only versus first, meant the difference between life and death for dozens of people, decided by which side of the ship they happened to be standing on. And underneath all of it, beneath the question of which side and which officer, ran the deepest and most damning division of all, the one written into the ship from the moment her decks were planned: class. Remember the gates. I told you we would come back to the gates. The lifeboats were up on the boat deck, at the very top of the ship, in the world of the first and second class. To reach them, you had to be up there, or you had to find your way up there, through the right corridors, up the right staircases, in a ship the size of a city, in the dark, with the floor tilting and the lights flickering and the water rising behind you. For the first class, this was easy. They were already there, or nearly. The boats were practically outside their doors. Stewards came to their cabins, helped them with their life belts, escorted them up. The path was short and familiar. For the third class, the 700-some emigrants in the bottom of the ship, the families chasing America, the path was a maze. Their quarters were deep in the vessel, far from the boat deck, separated from the upper decks by the very design of the ship, and by the gates. Those barriers, required by immigration regulations to keep steerage passengers segregated from the rest, which now stood between hundreds of people and the open air where the boats were. What exactly happened at those gates has been argued about for over a century, and the truth is almost certainly not a single villain locking the poor below to die. It was something more diffuse and, in a way, more terrible than that. It was confusion. It was a crew with no plan for evacuating steerage who had drilled for nothing like this. It was a language barrier. Many third-class passengers spoke little or no English and could not understand the shouted instructions, could not read the signs, did not know which of the bewildering corridors led up and out. It was stewards who, in some cases, kept their passengers waiting below for orders that came late or never came. It was a few gates that were genuinely kept closed for too long. And it was, above all, the simple physical fact of distance, that the people with the farthest to travel through the most confusing route with the least guidance were also the people the rising water would reach first. Some third-class passengers found their own way up, climbing through the ship by instinct and luck, breaking through where they could, dragging their children behind them. Some were helped by individual crew members who did the right thing. But many, far, far too many, were still down in the depths, or trapped in the corridors, or held behind barriers when the time ran out. Whole families, children, the people who had sold everything they owned for a ticket to a new life, who had stood at the rail watching Ireland disappear, who had thrown snowballs of iceberg ice just a couple of hours before. The numbers tell the story more brutally than any words can. In first class, the great majority of women and children survived. In third class, more than half of the women died, and most of the children, drowned. A first-class child had a survival rate near total. A third-class child had a survival rate that history can barely stand to look at. The same ocean, the same night, the same sinking ship. And your chance of living through it depended, with a precision that looks almost obscene, on which deck you had been permitted to sleep on. The Titanic did not just carry the inequalities of its age across the Atlantic. In its final 2 hours, it enforced them. It made them lethal. The floating cross-section of a civilization revealed, in the manner of its dying, exactly what that civilization valued and exactly what it did not. And the people in the water, when the time came, would be drawn overwhelmingly from the decks below, from the bottom of the ship, from the bottom of the world. In the final hour of a sinking ship, with the boats nearly gone and the truth fully arrived, you might expect chaos. And there was chaos. There were moments of panic, of pushing, of an officer firing a pistol into the air to hold back a rush at one of the last boats. There was terror. There was every ugly thing that fear does to people. But that is not what survivors remembered most. What they remembered, what they spoke about for the rest of their lives in voices that often broke, was something else, something almost incomprehensible. They remembered the dignity. They remembered how many people, faced with certain death and no place in a boat, chose how they would meet it. Let me tell you about a few of them, because these are the moments that lift this story up out of disaster and into something that has kept the world transfixed for over 100 years. These are the moments that are really why we are still telling it. Benjamin Guggenheim, the wealthy, fashionable man traveling with his mistress, the kind of man you would never expect to behave well, understood sometime in that last hour that he was going to die. He had helped women into the boats. There was no place for him, and he made no attempt to take one. And then, he did something extraordinary. He went back to his cabin with his valet, and he changed. He took off the heavy sweater and the life belt he had been given, and he put on his finest evening clothes, white tie, tails, the full formal dress of a gentleman going to a dinner party. He had his valet dress in the same way, and he came back up onto the tilting deck dressed for the grandest evening of his life, and he is reported to have said, in words that have echoed ever since, that he and his man had put on their best and were prepared to go down like gentlemen. He asked that, if his valet should survive and he should not, a message be carried to his wife that he had done his best, that no woman had been left aboard because Benjamin Guggenheim had been a coward. He was not a coward. Neither of them survived. They were last seen seated in the grand foyer, in their evening dress, waiting. And then there are the Strausses, Isidore and Ida, married more than 40 years, who wrote to each other every day they were apart. When the boats were being filled, a place was offered to Ida. As an elderly woman, she had every right to it, every expectation, every reason, and she would not take it. She would not leave her husband. The crew, understanding the situation, offered to let Isidore accompany her into the boat too. An old man, surely an exception could be made. But Isidore refused. He would not take a seat while younger men, while other people, still waited. He would not go before his time. And so Ida made her choice. She turned away from the boat, from the open seat, from survival, and she went back to her husband. And she said to him the words that have outlived every fortune Macy's ever made, words that more than a century has not worn down. She told him that they had lived together, and that she would not be parted from him now. Where he went, she would go. They gave Ida's maid her fur coat and a place in the boat, telling her she would not be needing it. And then the two of them, the old man and his wife of 40 years, were last seen sitting together on the deck, or walking arm in arm, as the sea came up to meet them. They had been together their whole lives, and they refused, at the very end, to be apart for even the time it would take to die. John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship, the one the public found so hard to love, the symbol of inherited privilege, placed his pregnant young wife Madeline into a lifeboat. He asked the officer whether he might join her, given her condition. He was told no. Men were not permitted in that boat. And Astor, who could have bought the entire ship and everyone on it, whose wealth was almost beyond counting, accepted it. He stepped back. He asked the number of the boat so he could find her later, a small, ordinary hope, as though there would be a later. He lit a cigarette. He stood on the deck and watched his wife and his unborn child lowered away into the dark, and he did not try to follow. His body was recovered from the sea days later. Madeline and the child survived. The boy she carried would be born months after his father went to the bottom of the Atlantic. Wealth could not save them. That is one of the strange, hard lessons the night kept teaching, over and over. The richest men in the world stood on that deck with the same ocean rising toward them as the poorest emigrant, and the ocean did not care what they were worth. In the end, the only thing class bought you was a better chance at a seat in a boat. And many of the men who could have fought their way into those seats chose, instead, to step back and to die well. And there was the band. The Titanic carried a small ensemble of musicians, led by a violinist named Wallace Hartley. Their job, for the whole voyage, had been to play in the lounges and the dining rooms, to provide the gentle background music of a luxury crossing. And on the last night, as the ship began to die, they did something that has become perhaps the single most enduring image of the entire disaster. They kept playing. They gathered, instruments in hand, and they played. Up on the deck, or near the entrance to the grand staircase, in the cold, as the ship settled and the boats pulled away and the panic rose around them. They played to keep people calm. They played because it was, somehow, the only thing left to do that was theirs to do. And they did not stop. Survivors in the boats, pulling away across the black water, heard the music carrying out over the sea, heard it continue as the deck tilted, as the lights began to fail, as the unthinkable became the present moment. There is a legend, debated but cherished, about what the final song was. Some say it was a hymn, a melody about being nearer to God, the kind of thing a dying ship might offer up into the night. We cannot be certain, but what we can be certain of is that the musicians played until very near the end, and that not a single one of them survived. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered with his music case still strapped to him. They went down playing, and the sound of that music, drifting across the freezing water in the last minutes, is one of those things that once you have imagined it, you cannot stop hearing. And Thomas Andrews, the man who built her, who had loved her, who knew before anyone that she was doomed, what became of him in those last hours? He did not stop working. For most of the night, he moved through the ship, helping people into their lifebelts, urging passengers toward the boats, throwing deck chairs into the sea so that those who ended up in the water might have something to cling to. He worked to save lives right up until the moment that work became impossible. And then, near the end, he was seen by a steward in the first-class smoking room. He was standing alone. His lifebelt was off, lying on a table beside him. He was staring at a large painting on the wall above the fireplace, a painting of a harbor, of a ship coming safely into port. He was not moving. He was not trying to save himself. The man who had designed the most magnificent ship in the world was standing, in silence, in the heart of his creation, watching it die, looking at a painted image of safe harbor that his real ship would never reach. It is one of the last reliable sightings of him. He went down with the Titanic, with the thing he had made, somewhere inside her. But not everyone on that ocean had given up, because there were two ships out there in the dark, and the contrast between them is one of the bitterest in the whole story. The Titanic had begun firing distress rockets. White flares shot up from the deck, exploding high overhead, the unmistakable signal of a ship in mortal danger. and the wireless was screaming into the night. Jack Phillips, the same operator who, an hour and a half earlier, had told the Californian to shut up, was now hunched over his key, sending the distress call over and over with everything he had. He sent the old code, CQD, and then, at the suggestion of his colleague Harold Bride, half in grim humor, he sent the newer code too, the one that was just coming into use, the one that would become the universal cry of the desperate forever after. SOS. The Titanic was one of the first ships in history to send that signal in a real emergency.
The call went out into the dark again and again, carrying the ship's position, begging anyone who could hear it to come. And one ship heard it, and answered, and ran. Far to the southeast, a smaller liner called the Carpathia picked up the distress call. Her wireless operator had very nearly gone to bed himself. He caught the message almost by chance in the last moments before he would have switched off. He brought it straight to his captain, a man named Arthur Rostron, who was woken in his cabin and given the news that the Titanic was sinking 58 miles away. What Rostron did next is one of the few unambiguously heroic things in this entire story. He did not hesitate. He turned his ship toward the Titanic's position and ordered every ounce of speed his vessel could give, driving the Carpathia faster than she had ever gone, faster than her builders thought she could go, the engineers below feeding the fires until the whole ship shook. And he did this knowing that he was about to race at full speed through the very same ice field that was, at that moment, killing the Titanic. He posted extra lookouts. He prepared his ship to receive survivors, blankets, hot drinks, the doctors ready, the boats swung out. And he drove through the ice in the dark, at a speed that risked his own ship and everyone on her, because there were people dying ahead of him, and he was the only one coming. But 58 miles is 58 miles. Even at full, reckless, heroic speed, the Carpathia could not arrive for hours. She was racing toward a ship that had less than 2 hours to live. She would not, could not, arrive in time to save anyone who could not first survive the ocean itself. And the other ship, the Californian, stopped in the ice, close, far closer than the Carpathia, close enough that her lights may have been visible from the Titanic's deck, close enough that the dying ship fired its rockets in part toward her, hoping, praying that someone aboard would see and understand and come. And someone aboard the Californian did see. Crew members on watch saw the rockets, white rockets, climbing into the sky and bursting, again and again, from the direction of a large ship sitting low on the horizon. They saw them. They reported them to their officers. They even tried to signal the strange ship with a flashing lamp. But the Californian's wireless was off. The operator was asleep, his set silent, because hours earlier he had been told to keep out, to shut up, and had taken off his headphones and gone to bed. And so the rockets were seen but not understood. White rockets could mean many things, the officers reasoned. Perhaps it was a company signal. Perhaps the other ship was just communicating with someone. They did not grasp, they did not let themselves grasp, that they were watching a ship send up the universal signal of a vessel dying, with 1,500 people aboard, a few miles away, across water they could have crossed. No one woke the captain with sufficient urgency. No one turned the wireless back on to listen. The Californian sat in the ice through the entire sinking, watching the rockets, and did nothing. By the time her crew began to suspect, by the time they finally roused the operator and switched the set back on in the gray light of morning, it was over. The Titanic was gone, and the only thing left on the sea where she had been was the Carpathia, picking the living and the dead out of the freezing water. How many could the Californian have saved had her operator not been told to shut up, had he not turned off his radio, had her crew understood what they were watching? Perhaps not everyone. Perhaps the timing would still have been cruel. But she was close enough that she might have reached the boats, might have plucked people from the water before the cold took them, might have changed the number that history records from 1,500 dead to something far smaller. That is the weight the Californian would carry forever. Not that she caused the disaster,
but that she was right there, within reach, and slept through it. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the Titanic was dying in earnest, and there was no longer any pretending otherwise. The bow was deep underwater now. The forward decks, where the iceberg ice had fallen and children had played just over 2 hours before, were beneath the sea. The angle of the ship had grown from a faint downward tilt into a pronounced, frightening slope, and it was steepening. People on the deck had to hold on. Loose objects, deck chairs, bottles, anything not fixed down, began to slide forward toward the drowned bow. And the stern, the back of the ship, was rising. Slowly, inexorably, the propellers and the great rudder were lifting out of the water and into the freezing night air, climbing higher as the bow went down. The last boats were gone. The collapsible boats, canvas-sided crafts stored on the roofs of the officers' quarters, meant as a final reserve, were being fought over, struggled with. Some of them floated off the deck as the water reached them, rather than properly launched. Hundreds of people were now crowded into the stern, climbing toward the back of the ship as it rose, away from the advancing water, hurtling upward and backward in a desperate, instinctive retreat from the sea, even though there was nowhere to retreat to, even though every foot they climbed only delayed the inevitable by minutes. And then the lights went out. For most of the sinking, against all reason, the Titanic's lights had stayed on. Down in the bowels of the ship, those anonymous engineers and firemen we spoke of had stayed at their posts in the rising water, keeping the generators running, keeping the power flowing, keeping the ship lit and the wireless alive so the distress calls could keep going out. They held the dark back with their own labor and their own lives, long past the point of any hope for themselves. And then, near the very end, the water reached them, or the generators finally failed, and the lights of the Titanic, which had blazed across the ocean like a small floating city, flickered, glowed a dull red for a moment, and died. The great ship went black against the brilliant star-filled sky, and in the darkness, the end came fast. With the bow flooded and the stern lifted high into the air, the Titanic could no longer hold herself together. The structure had never been designed to bear that kind of stress, the entire weight of the rising stern hanging in the air, unsupported, while the flooded bow dragged downward. The steel could not take it. And so, somewhere around the middle of the ship, between the third and fourth funnels, the Titanic broke. She tore apart, with a sound that survivors described in a dozen different ways: a roar, a series of explosions, a tremendous rending crash, the sound of the world coming apart. The ship split in two. The bow section, already full of water, broke away and began its long descent toward the bottom. And the stern, suddenly freed from the weight that had been dragging it down, fell back, settled toward something closer to level for a moment, a horrible false reprieve, and then began to flood and tilt and rise again on its own, the hundreds of people still clinging to it lifted once more toward the vertical. For years this was disputed. Many of the official accounts, the inquiries, insisted that the Titanic sank intact, going down in one piece. Some survivors swore she had broken apart before their eyes. Others, traumatized, confused in the dark, said she had not. The official story for decades was that she sank whole. It would take 73 years and a discovery on the floor of the Atlantic to prove that the survivors who said she broke in two had been telling the truth all along. The stern rose until it stood nearly vertical, a black tower of steel against the stars, the propellers high in the air, hundreds of people clinging to the railings, the decks, anything they could hold. And then it began to go down, slowly at first, and then faster, sliding down into the sea, drawing the people down with it, until the very last of the Titanic, the highest point of the rising stern, the place where the last people clung, slipped beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. It was 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, on the 15th of April, 1912. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the iceberg. The ship that could not sink was gone. The sea closed over her, and the surface of the ocean, where the largest moving object ever made by human hands had floated a moment before, was simply empty. Black water under a sky full of stars.
And then came the sound. More than 1,500 people did not go down with the ship. Most of them ended up in the water. The collapsibles that floated free, the people swept off the decks, the ones who jumped at the last moment, the ones the stern had carried under and who clawed their way back to the surface, they were now in the sea. And the sea was 28 degrees, below freezing. The kind of cold that is not really cold at all, in the way we understand the word. It is an assault. It is 1,000 knives. It stops the breath in the chest and seizes the muscles and floods the body with a panic that the mind cannot override. And from all of those people, scattered across the dark water in their lifebelts, there rose a sound. A single, vast, continuous sound, made of 1,500 individual voices crying out at once, for help, for God, for their mothers, for the boats, in a dozen languages, a wall of human anguish rolling out across the calm sea under the indifferent stars. The survivors in the lifeboats, floating a safe distance away, heard it. And of all the things they witnessed that night, this is the thing they could never escape. Many of them refused to speak of it for the rest of their lives. The ones who did described it almost identically across the decades. A sound like nothing else they had ever heard, or ever would. A sound that they said would stay in their ears until the day they died. Some compared it, helplessly, to the noise of a crowd at a sporting event, or to a swarm, or to locusts, reaching for any comparison that might let them hold it at a distance, and then breaking off, because there was no real comparison. It was the sound of 1,500 people freezing to death in the dark, all at the same time, within earshot of safety. And here is the part that has tormented people for over a century, because it raises a question with no comfortable answer. The lifeboats were not full. Many of them had empty seats. Some of them, many empty seats, floating just a few hundred yards from 1,000 people dying in the water. And almost none of them went back. The reasoning, in the moment, was not pure cowardice, though there was surely some of that too. The people in the boats were terrified, and not without cause, that if they rowed back into the mass of drowning people, the desperate swimmers would swamp the boat, would cling to the sides, would capsize it in their panic and drag everyone down. A lifeboat that goes into a crowd of drowning people can very easily become another group of drowning people. The sailors knew this. And so, in most of the boats, the decision was made, sometimes argued over bitterly, sometimes simply enforced by fear, to wait, to stay clear, to let the cries die down before going back, by which time it would be too late. Because the water at 28 degrees does its work in minutes, not hours. The cries lasted, by most accounts, somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour. And then, gradually, terribly, they began to fade. Voice by voice, the sound thinned out as the cold took people one by one, until at last the great chorus of anguish dwindled to a few scattered calls, and then to silence. A silence that the survivors said was, somehow, even worse than the sound had been. The flat, calm, star-filled, absolute silence of the North Atlantic, closing back over everything, as though none of it had ever happened. When the boats finally did go back, and a few of them did after the cries had mostly stopped, they found almost no one alive. The water was full of the dead, floating upright in their lifebelts, hundreds of them, faces turned up to the stars. Out of all the people who had gone into that freezing sea, the boats that returned managed to pull only a literal handful back from the dead. The cold had won. The window had been minutes wide, and it had closed while the boats waited. Margaret Brown, the woman the legend would call unsinkable, was in one of those boats, and she fought hard, to make the others turn back, into the cries. She seized an oar herself. She threatened, by some accounts, to throw the man in charge overboard if he would not let them row toward the people in the water. She was overruled, restrained, outvoted by terror. And she would carry that, the sound, and the not going back, like so many of them did, for the rest of her life. One boat, under an officer who steeled himself to it, did go back fairly soon,
and did pull several living people from the water, transferring his own passengers to other boats first to make room. A few souls owe their lives to that single act of courage against the paralysis of fear. But for the overwhelming majority of the people in the water, no boat came in time. They died within sight of the empty seats. They died a few hundred yards from the people who could hear them. And the people who could hear them lived the rest of their lives knowing it. This is the part of the story that resists every attempt to make it bearable. Because there is no villain here to blame. Not really. The people in the boats were not monsters. They were ordinary, frightened human beings, making a calculation that was, in cold terms, not entirely wrong. And yet the result of that calculation was that 1,000 people froze to death within reach of help. The disaster did not end with the sinking of the ship. The cruelest hour came after, in the water, in the dark, in the long minutes between the breaking of the Titanic and the fading of the cries, an hour in which the difference between the living and the dead was, in many cases, nothing more than a short row across calm water that no one dared to make. For the people in the lifeboats, the night was not over. It had, in a sense, only begun, because now they had to survive it. They were scattered across miles of black ocean in 20 small boats, many of them underfilled, some of them barely managed by passengers who had never held an oar, in a cold so severe that the spray froze and the breath crystallized, and the hands of the rowers cracked and bled. There was no light but the stars. There was no certainty that anyone was coming. The distress calls had gone out, yes, but the people in the boats did not know if they had been heard, did not know if a ship was racing toward them, or if they were simply alone on the empty Atlantic, waiting to freeze one by one as the people in the water had frozen. Children cried and were hushed. Women who had watched their husbands stay behind sat in silence, or wept, or stared at the place where the ship had been. People prayed. People sang, in some boats, to keep their spirits up and to keep the cold from winning. The hours crawled, and the cold worked on them steadily, patiently, because even out of the water, exposure at those temperatures kills, and some of the people in the boats, the very young, the very old, the ones already weakened, did not live to see the morning. They died quietly, in the boats, in the arms of strangers, with rescue only hours away. And then there was the most extraordinary survival story of the entire night. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the man who had enforced women and children only on the port side, the man who had sent boats down half empty rather than let men board, had gone down with the ship. He had been sucked against a ventilation grate as the water took him, pinned underwater by the inrushing sea, certain he was about to die. And then a blast of hot air from somewhere deep in the dying ship blew him back to the surface. He found himself in the freezing water beside an overturned collapsible boat, one of the canvas craft that had floated off the deck upside down. Lightoller climbed onto the upturned hull, and he was not alone. One by one, other men in the water found that overturned boat and clawed their way up onto its slippery, rounded bottom, until some 30 men were balanced on top of a capsized lifeboat in the middle of the North Atlantic, in the dark, with the freezing sea inches below them, and the boat slowly losing its trapped air and settling lower as the night wore on. To stay alive, to keep the boat from rolling or sinking, Lightoller organized them. He had them stand. He had them shift their weight together, leaning as one body, left when the swell came from the left, right when it came from the right, balancing on the hull of an overturned boat for hours, a row of freezing men swaying in unison in the dark to keep themselves from tipping into the sea. Among the men on that upturned boat was Harold Bride, one of the wireless operators, his feet crushed and frozen. And as they balanced there through the small hours, Lightoller led them in prayer, and they waited, and they swayed, and they held on. More than one of them did not make it. Men slipped off in the night, or simply died standing, and were let go into the water to keep the boat afloat for the rest. But most of them survived, balanced on the bottom of a capsized lifeboat by the will and the seamanship of one man, until the morning came. And the morning did come. As the sky in the east began to gray, then to flush with the first faint colors of dawn, the people in the boats saw two things they would never forget. The first was the light of a ship, a real ship, rockets going up from her in answer to the Titanic's, coming toward them across the sea. The Carpathia. Captain Rostron had driven his vessel through the ice all night at a speed that should not have been possible, and he had arrived. Help had come. Battered, frozen, grieving, the survivors saw rescue rising over the horizon, and a sound went up from the boats that was the opposite of the sound from the water, a sound of weeping and of disbelieving joy. And the second thing they saw, as the light grew, was where they were. They were surrounded by ice. As the dawn revealed the sea around them, the survivors found themselves floating in the middle of a vast field of icebergs and pack ice. Great white and blue-green mountains scattered across the water in every direction, glowing pink and gold in the rising sun. It was, by every account, breathtakingly beautiful. And it was the thing that had killed them. The field of ice they had been warned about all the day before. The ice that ship after ship had tried to tell the Titanic was lying directly across her path, now lay revealed all around them in the gentle light of morning, indifferent and gorgeous, the most beautiful and the most terrible sight any of them had ever seen. The Carpathia picked her way carefully through that ice toward the scattered boats, and one by one, through the morning, she took the survivors aboard. They came up the side in slings and on ladders and in mail sacks, the children hauled up like cargo, the frozen and the injured lifted with care, the survivors of the unsinkable ship climbing the side of the small liner that had come for them. Rostron's crew gave them blankets and brandy and hot soup, and their own cabins and their own clothes. The Carpathia's own passengers, woken to find their ship transformed into a floating hospital and a house of mourning, gave up everything they had to help. And as the survivors came aboard, the full shape of the catastrophe began to reveal itself in the most intimate and unbearable way. Because now they could count. Now the wives could look for their husbands, and the children could look for their fathers, and the friends could look for their friends, among the faces being lifted from the boats. And again and again and again, the person they were looking for was not there, was not in any boat, was not coming. The Carpathia gathered up around 700 survivors that morning, and every one of them was now learning, face by absent face, who had not survived. Around 700 living, more than 1,500 gone. Out of more than 2,200 souls who had sailed, only about a third were alive to feel the deck of the Carpathia beneath their feet. The rest were behind them, in the water, in the ice, and, though no one yet knew it, 2.5 miles down, settling onto the floor of the Atlantic in the cold and the dark, where they would lie, undisturbed, for the next 73 years. When the last boat had been emptied and the last survivor brought aboard, Captain Rostron held a brief service on the Carpathia, a prayer of thanks for the saved and a prayer for the dead. And then he turned his ship around and pointed her back toward New York, carrying his cargo of grief and disbelief, of widows and orphans and frozen survivors wrapped in borrowed blankets, away from the empty patch of ocean where the greatest ship in the world had been, the morning before, the safest place that any of them had ever stood. The sea where the Titanic had sunk was, by then, perfectly calm again, strewn with wreckage and deck chairs and the floating dead, yes, but calm. The same flat, glassy, beautiful calm that had hidden the iceberg in the first place. As though the ocean had already begun to forget, as though it had simply closed over the whole impossible night and gone back to being what it had always been, vast, ancient, indifferent, and entirely unimpressed by the ambitions of the people who crossed it. The news reached land before the survivors did, and what happened in those first hours is a story in itself, a story about how the world had become connected enough to spread information instantly, but not yet wise enough to know what to do with it. The first wireless reports were fragmentary, garbled, contradictory. The Titanic had struck an iceberg. The Titanic was being towed to port. All passengers had been saved. The ship was damaged but afloat. These early messages, half heard across hundreds of miles of crackling wireless and passed from operator to operator and newspaper to newspaper, produced a catastrophe of misinformation. Some morning papers ran headlines reassuring the world that everyone was safe, that the great ship was limping toward Halifax, that there had been no loss of life, The most advanced ship in the world had been involved in an accident, the story went, and the most advanced ship in the world had, of course, kept her passengers safe. For most of a day, the families of the passengers lived inside that lie. Crowds gathered outside the White Star Line offices in New York and in London and in Southampton, holding the early newspapers, telling each other that all was well, that their people were safe, waiting for the official confirmation of the good news. And then the truth began to arrive, piece by terrible piece. The Carpathia, steaming toward New York, had the survivor list, and only the survivor list. As her wireless slowly transmitted the names of the living, the world did the arithmetic in reverse. Every name that was read out was a person saved, and every name that was not read out, every name on the passenger manifest that did not appear on the survivor list, was a person gone. The crowds outside the offices watched the lists go up, and the silence that fell over those crowds as people scanned the names and did not find the one they were looking for is one of the quiet horrors of the whole affair. The cheering stopped. The reassurance curdled. The realization spread through the waiting families that the early reports had been wrong, that the unthinkable had happened, that more than 1,500 people were dead. Southampton was hit hardest of all, because the crew of the Titanic, the stewards, the firemen, the trimmers, the cooks, the able seamen, the men who had kept the lights burning, had been drawn overwhelmingly from that one English port town, and the crew had died in enormous numbers. Whole streets in Southampton lost their men. Schools reported children who would not be coming back, or fathers who would not be coming home. There were neighborhoods where nearly every house had lost someone. The disaster, which the world remembers for its millionaires, fell most heavily on a working-class town in the south of England, and on the emigrant families in the bottom of the ship, and on the anonymous men who shoveled coal in the dark. When the Carpathia finally reached New York 3 nights after the sinking, she came in through a harbor lined with thousands of waiting people and a flotilla of boats, in the rain, in the dark. And the world got its first sight of the survivors. They came down the gangway in their borrowed clothes, dazed, hollow-eyed, many of them having lost husbands and fathers and children and everything they owned. Photographers and reporters surged toward them. The age of mass media had arrived, and it had found its first great global tragedy, and it would not let go. One of the survivors who came down that gangway was J. Bruce Ismay. Remember Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, the man at the dinner table all those years ago who had dreamed up the trio of giant ships, the man whose ambition had hovered over the question of the Titanic's speed. He had been aboard for the maiden voyage of his masterpiece, and he had survived. He had gotten into one of the last collapsible boats as it was being lowered. There were, by his account and the accounts of some witnesses, no women or children in the immediate vicinity at that moment, and the boat was about to go down with empty seats, and he stepped in. By the strict letter of what had happened, it may not have been so different from what other surviving men had done. But it did not matter what the letter said, because J. Bruce Ismay was not just any man. He was the head of the line. He was, in the public mind, the personification of the company that had built a ship with too few lifeboats and sent it speeding through an ice field to make a headline. And while more than 1,500 people had died, while women and children of the third class had drowned in the bottom of his ship, the man at the very top had climbed into a boat and saved himself. The press destroyed him. On both sides of the Atlantic, Ismay became the villain of the story, the coward who had survived when better people died, the man who, the newspapers sneered, should have gone down with his ship. They gave him cruel nicknames. They printed savage cartoons. He was vilified at the inquiries, his every word picked apart, his survival held up as a kind of moral crime. Whatever the precise truth of how he got into that boat, and historians still argue about how fair the verdict was, the verdict was passed, and it was merciless, and it stuck. And here is the strange, haunting coda to Ismay. He lived. He lived for another quarter of a century.
But the man who walked off the Carpathia was, by every account, broken. He withdrew from public life. He grew quiet, reclusive, marked. He had survived the Titanic, and surviving it had cost him everything that made survival worth anything: his reputation, his standing, his peace. He carried the disaster with him for the rest of his days, the most famous survivor of the most famous shipwreck in history, a man who had lived through the night and never escaped it. There is an argument, a dark one, that the people who died in the water got off more easily than the man who climbed into the boat and had to live in the world that came after. He had wanted to make history with the Titanic. He succeeded, just not in the way he had dreamed at that dinner table, with the brandy and the ambition and the names borrowed from giants. The world demanded answers, and it demanded them immediately. Within days of the Carpathia's arrival, the United States Senate launched an inquiry, and Britain soon followed with its own. For weeks, the survivors and the crew and the officers and the experts were summoned to testify, and the strange, fragmentary, contradictory pieces of that night were laid out and examined under oath. And the modern world began the long process, a process that has never really ended, of trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong. And what the inquiries found, in the end, was not a single catastrophic failure. It was the thing that makes this story so much more disturbing than a simple tale of an iceberg. They found a chain. A long chain of small, ordinary, individually defensible decisions, each one a link, and not one of them on its own fatal, but all of them together, holding on the same night. The speed maintained through a known ice field. The ice warnings that were received and acknowledged and never fully acted upon. The Masaba warning that may never have reached the bridge, lost in the flood of passenger telegrams. The wireless operators working for a private company, prioritizing the trivial messages of the wealthy over the safety of the ship. The lookouts without binoculars because of a key in the wrong pocket. The lifeboats, too few by a law decades out of date, and then lowered half-empty in the disbelief of the early hours. The Californian, close enough to save almost everyone, with her wireless off and her crew watching the rockets and doing nothing. The bulkheads that did not reach high enough. The double hull that was never built. The drills that were never held. Pull any single link and the chain breaks. Give the lookouts their binoculars, and perhaps fleet sees the iceberg 10 seconds sooner, and 10 seconds is enough to clear it. Slow the ship by a few knots, and the same. Keep the Californian's wireless on, and she comes, and she saves hundreds. Fill the early lifeboats, and the death toll drops by a third. Build the bulkheads higher, and the ship floats long enough for the Carpathia to arrive, and take everyone off in a calm transfer, exactly as the engineers had always assumed she would. Any one of these, any single one. But that is not how disasters work. Disasters are not usually one great mistake. They are the alignment of many small ones, a long row of holes and many separate slices of defense, each hole harmless on its own, lining up just once, on just the wrong night, to open a clear path straight through to catastrophe. The Titanic did not sink because of an iceberg. The Titanic sank because, on the night of the 14th of April 1912, every single hole lined up at once. And the people who made those small decisions were not fools or monsters. They were competent, experienced, well-meaning people, doing their jobs the way their jobs had always been done, inside a system that everyone trusted because it had never failed before. That is the part that should keep us awake. Not that bad people caused the disaster, but that good, ordinary, careful people, operating exactly as they were supposed to, inside the best system the most advanced civilization in history had built, sent 1,500 human beings to the bottom of the ocean, and never saw it coming until it was already too late to stop. Out of all that death came change. That is the one redemptive thread in the whole story, and it is worth holding on to, because the people who died on the Titanic did not, in the end, die for nothing. The world they left behind was forced, by the sheer scale of the horror, to fix the things that had killed them. The lifeboats came first and fastest.
The grotesque arithmetic, boats for half the people aboard, was abolished almost overnight. New regulations required that ships carry enough lifeboats for every single soul on board. Not a percentage, not a tonnage calculation. Everyone. It seems so obvious now, so blindingly obvious, that it is hard to believe it ever needed to be written into law. But it did, and it was written in the blood of the people who froze in the water beside empty seats. The wireless was next. Never again would a ship's radio be allowed to fall silent in the night because the operator's shift had ended.
New rules required that ships maintain a wireless watch around the clock, 24 hours a day, so that no distress call would ever again go out into the dark and find only a sleeping operator on the other side. The thing that had doomed the people the Californian might have saved, a radio switched off, a man gone to bed, was made impossible by law. And distress signals were standardized so that the confusion aboard the Californian, rockets seen but not understood, white flares that might have meant a dozen things, could never happen in quite the same way again. The international community agreed, finally, on what a ship in mortal danger should send up into the night, and on the absolute obligation of every ship that saw it to respond. Out of the disaster came the International Ice Patrol, a permanent service born directly from the Titanic, established to track the icebergs that drift down out of the Arctic into the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic, to map them and broadcast their positions and warn the ships that follow the same path the Titanic followed. More than a century later, that patrol still exists. Every iceberg season, vessels and aircraft still go out over the cold, gray water of the North Atlantic to find the ice and warn the ships, in an unbroken vigil that began the year the Titanic sank and has never stopped since. The ice that killed her has been watched every year ever since because of her. And out of it all came a great international agreement on the safety of life at sea, a framework first convened in the immediate aftermath of the disaster that codified lifeboats and wireless watches and ice patrols and bulkheads and drills into binding international law. It has been revised and expanded again and again over the decades, but its origin is the Titanic. The single most important set of maritime safety regulations in the world traces its ancestry directly to one freezing night in April of 1912. Every passenger who has crossed an ocean safely in the century since, every cruise ship drill, every lifeboat for every passenger, every 24-hour radio watch, every iceberg warning, owes something to the 1,500 people who died because none of it existed yet. It is a brutal way for a civilization to learn. We tend to fix things only after they have killed enough people to force the issue, and the Titanic forced the issue at a cost of 1,500 lives. But the lessons held, the reforms worked. The chain of small failures that killed the Titanic was, link by link, broken by law, so that it could never align in quite the same way again. The dead bought safety for everyone who came after. That is something. In a story with so little comfort in it, that is something to hold. There was one piece of the story, though, that never found a clean resolution, and it haunts the edges of the disaster to this day. The Californian. Her captain, Stanley Lord, became one of the most controversial figures in maritime history. The inquiries on both sides of the Atlantic concluded that his ship had been close enough to the Titanic to have come to her aid, that the rocket seen by his crew had been the Titanic's distress signals, and that the Californian could and should have responded, and that, had she done so, she might have saved many lives. It was a devastating verdict, and it followed Lord for the rest of his days. He spent decades fighting it, insisting that the ship his crew had seen was not the Titanic, that another vessel had been between them, that the distances did not add up, that he had been made a scapegoat for a tragedy he could not have prevented. And the truth is that the evidence is genuinely murky. The exact positions, the exact distances, what was actually visible from each deck on that strange, cold, light-bending night, these have been argued over by serious people for more than a century, and there are still those who believe Stanley Lord was unfairly condemned. But whatever the precise geometry, the larger shape of it is hard to escape. A ship was close. Her crew saw rockets going up from another vessel, again and again,
all night long. And no one woke the wireless operator, and no one understood, and no one came. Whether the Californian could have saved everyone, or many, or only a few, she did nothing, and a few miles away, 1,500 people died. That is the weight Stanley Lord carried, fairly or not, into his grave. 2 ships, the same dark sea. One of them, 58 miles away, drove through the ice all night at suicidal speed because there were people dying and someone had to come. The other, perhaps only a few miles away, watched the rockets and went back to sleep. The difference between Arthur Rostron and Stanley Lord is, in the end, the difference between the 2 things a human being can do when they glimpse another human being in danger. And the Titanic, among everything else it became the place where those 2 responses were preserved forever, side by side, for the rest of us to look at and to wonder which one we would have been. But to understand why the Titanic still grips us, why of all the maritime disasters in history, of all the ships that have sunk with great loss of life, this one and only this one became immortal, you have to step back from the night itself and look at the moment in history where it sits. Because the Titanic was not just a ship, it was a symbol, and it became a symbol at the exact instant the age it symbolized was about to end. Remember where we began, an age that believed in progress the way earlier ages believed in God. A civilization drunk on its own mastery, convinced that science and steel and human ingenuity had finally tamed the natural world, that the old terrors had been conquered, that there were no limits left. The Titanic was the perfect physical expression of that faith, the largest, most luxurious, most advanced moving object ever built, declared practically unsinkable, the crowning proof that human beings had risen above the dangers that had humbled every generation before them. And the sea sank it on its first voyage. The ocean, old, patient, indifferent, exactly as dangerous as it had always been, reached up and took the unsinkable ship and 1,500 of its passengers down into the dark, and it did so casually, almost carelessly, with a single block of floating ice. The most advanced civilization in history met the oldest force in the world, and the oldest force in the world won, without even seeming to try. You could not invent a more perfect parable if you tried. The hubris and the fall, the tower of human pride and the cold water closing over it. The richest men in the world and the poorest emigrants going down into the same sea, which valued them all at exactly nothing. People felt it immediately in 1912. They sensed that something larger than a shipwreck had happened. They sensed that the confidence of the age had been wounded, that the great optimistic story the modern world had been telling itself, the story of endless upward progress and the conquest of nature, had just been contradicted in the most spectacular and undeniable way imaginable. And then, just 2 years later, the rest of that confidence was annihilated entirely. Because in the summer of 1914, barely 2 years after the Titanic went down, the same civilization that had built her marched into the First World War. The same faith in progress and machinery and the mastery of the modern age that had produced the unsinkable ship now produced the machine gun and the artillery barrage and the poison gas, and it fed an entire generation of young men into the mud and the wire of the Western Front, and it killed them not by the 1,000, but by the million. The optimistic, golden, gilded world, the Edwardian summer, the long, bright afternoon of European confidence, was gone, burned away, and the people who lived through both events came to feel, looking back, that the Titanic had been the first crack, the omen, the warning shot, the moment the music faltered, 2 years before the whole orchestra was silenced. That is why the Titanic became immortal and 1,000 other shipwrecks did not. It was not just the scale of the death, terrible as that was. It was the timing. It was the symbolism. It was the way the disaster seemed to say, in one unforgettable image, everything that the next decade would prove in blood. The unsinkable ship that sank. The conquerors of nature, conquered. The confident age, drowned in the cold and the dark, just before the world it had built came apart at the seams. The Titanic was the last chapter of a story the modern world had been telling itself about its own invincibility. And when she went down, that story went down with her. Some part of the human race grew up that night, lost something it could never get back, a kind of innocence, a kind of certainty. We have never quite believed in our own unsinkability the same way since. We learned in the freezing water of the North Atlantic the lesson that every generation has to learn and that none of them ever fully keep, that the sea is still the sea, that nature is not a problem we have solved, and that the more certain we become that we have escaped the old dangers, the more completely those dangers are waiting for us, patient and silent, directly ahead in the dark. For 73 years, no one knew exactly where she was. Think about that. The most famous ship in the world, the subject of inquiries and books and films and an entire mythology, and for nearly 3/4 of a century, no living person knew the precise spot on the floor of the Atlantic where she lay. The position recorded on the night of the sinking turned out to be wrong, off by miles, a navigational error in the chaos of the disaster. The Titanic had gone down somewhere in a vast stretch of deep ocean, more than 2 miles below the surface, in a place so dark and so cold and so crushingly deep that for decades it was simply beyond the reach of human beings. She had slipped out of the world entirely. She existed only in memory. And people wanted her back. Almost from the moment she sank, there were dreams of finding her, raising her, returning her to the light. Schemes were proposed, to fill the wreck with ping-pong balls, or to encase her in ice and float it to the surface, or any number of fantastical engineering fantasies. None of them were remotely possible. The Titanic was lost in a part of the planet that was, for most of the 20th century, as inaccessible as the surface of the moon. The deep ocean kept its secret. She lay there in the dark, undisturbed, while the world above her changed beyond recognition. Through 2 world wars, through the rise and fall of empires, through the entire span of the 20th century, and no human eye looked upon her. Until 1985. The man who found her was an American oceanographer named Robert Ballard, and the story of how he found her is one of the great quiet ironies of the whole saga. Because Ballard was not, officially, looking for the Titanic at all. He had struck a bargain with the United States Navy. The Navy wanted him to use his deep-sea exploration technology to locate and survey the wrecks of 2 nuclear submarines that had been lost in the Atlantic during the Cold War, a classified, sensitive mission. Ballard agreed, on one condition, that if there was time left over after he had completed the Navy's secret work, he could use it to search for the Titanic. The Navy agreed, partly because they doubted he would find her, and partly because the search for the Titanic made an excellent cover story for what he was really out there doing. And it was in studying those sunken submarines that Ballard learned the trick that would find the Titanic. He noticed that when a ship sinks in deep water, it does not simply land in one place. As it goes down, it sheds a long trail of debris, heavier objects sinking faster and falling closer, lighter objects drifting on the currents and settling farther away, leaving a scattered field of wreckage spread across the sea floor like a comet's tail. Searching for the hull itself, a single object in a vast emptiness, was nearly hopeless. But searching for the debris field, a long, wide trail of scattered objects, gave you a much larger target. Find the trail and follow it, and it would lead you to the ship. So in the late summer of 1985, with the Navy's work done and only a sliver of time remaining, Ballard and a French team began to sweep the sea floor with cameras, looking not for the Titanic, but for her wake of debris. For days they found nothing but featureless mud, the empty floor of the abyss scrolling past on their monitors hour after hour, the clock running down, the mission almost out of time. And then, in the small hours of the morning on the 1st of September 1985, something appeared on the screen. At first it was just a shape in the mud, man-made, round. And then the cameras passed over it, and the watching team understood what they were seeing. It was a boiler. One of the great coal-fired boilers of the Titanic, lying on the floor of the Atlantic, 2.5 miles down, exactly where it had come to rest after falling through the cold and the dark for the better part of an hour, 73 years before. The debris trail had led them to her. After all the decades, after all the dreams and the schemes and the failures, a human being was looking, on a flickering monitor in the middle of the night, at the Titanic. And the mood in that control room, by every account, was not triumph. It very quickly stopped being triumph, because someone did the arithmetic that the people in the room could not avoid. They realized that the moment of their discovery, the small hours of the morning, somewhere around 2 o'clock, was almost exactly the time of night, 73 years earlier, when the Titanic had broken apart and gone down, and the people had begun to die in the water. They had found her at her own hour, and the celebration died in their throats, and they went up onto the deck of their ship in the dark, and they stood in silence over the place where 1,500 people lay, 2.5 miles below their feet. When they sent the cameras and, later, the submersibles down to look at her properly, what they found settled one of the oldest arguments about the disaster and opened 100 new ones. The first thing they confirmed was the breakup. The Titanic lay on the seafloor in 2 main pieces, the bow and the stern, separated by 1/3 of a mile of scattered debris. The survivors who had sworn, against the official record, that she had torn in 2 before their eyes, had been right all along. The bow section, the part that had filled with water first, had glided down relatively intact, planing through 2.5 miles of water and driving deep into the mud, still recognizably the front of a great ship. The railings, the anchor chains, the shape of her, eerily preserved. The stern was a different story. The stern, which had risen up and twisted and then plunged down separately, full of trapped air that crushed and exploded as the pressure mounted on the way down, had been torn almost beyond recognition. It lay in a chaos of mangled, peeled-back steel, the violence of its descent written into every twisted plate. The bow looked like a ship. The stern looked like what the deep ocean does to anything that falls into it. And between them, across the debris field, lay the strewn contents of a sunken world. Because the debris field was not just steel. It was things. The personal possessions of 2,200 people, scattered across the floor of the Atlantic, and preserved by the cold and the dark and the depth. Wine bottles, still corked. Dishes from the dining saloons, white china stamped with the White Star logo, lying upright in the mud in neat rows as though set on an invisible shelf. A child's doll. Bed frames. A chamber pot. Lumps of coal. That 600 tons a day, scattered everywhere. Suitcases. A silver platter. The everyday objects of human life, the things people had packed for a new beginning, lying undisturbed where they had fallen through the dark 3/4 of a century before. And the shoes. This is the detail that, for many people, is the hardest of all. The deep ocean, over the decades, consumed almost everything organic. The bodies of the people who went down with the ship are long gone, dissolved, consumed, returned to the sea, no trace of them remaining. But leather, treated leather, the leather of shoes, resists the creatures of the deep. And so, all across the wreck site, in the mud, lie pairs of shoes, a pair of boots side by side, a pair of small shoes beside a larger pair. And each pair of shoes, lying together in the position they were in when their owner came to rest, marks a place where a human being lay down on the floor of the Atlantic and never got up. There is no body. There is only the shape of where the body was, written in the leather of the shoes that the sea could not eat. The wreck of the Titanic is, in this sense, a gravesite, the largest, deepest, coldest gravesite in the world. And the shoes are the headstones. That discovery launched a long and bitter argument that is never fully ended. What should be done with her? Some, Robert Ballard among them, argued that the wreck should be left entirely alone, treated as a sacred site, a memorial and a tomb, never touched, never disturbed, never plundered. Others mounted expeditions to recover artifacts from the debris field, bringing thousands of objects up to the surface, to preserve them, they said, to display them, to keep the memory alive before the wreck itself was gone. The recovered objects went into museums and exhibitions, and, in some cases, private hands. The dishes, the jewelry, the personal effects of the dead lifted from the seafloor and brought back into the light. To some, it was preservation. To others, it was grave robbing. The debate over who owns the Titanic, who has the right to touch her, what we owe to the dead 2.5 miles down, it goes on to this day. And while the living argue, the Titanic herself is quietly, steadily vanishing. The Titanic is being eaten. Not by salvagers, though they have taken their share. By something far older and far more patient. When Ballard's cameras first found her, the wreck was draped in strange formations hanging from the railings and the steel. Long, rust-colored, icicle-like growths that drooped from every surface like the melting wax of enormous candles. Scientists gave them a name, rusticles. And the rusticles are not simply rust. They are alive. They are colonies of bacteria, organisms that had never been described before, that thrive in the crushing cold and pressure of the deep ocean, and that do one thing, slowly and relentlessly, with all the time in the world. They eat iron. The Titanic is, to these creatures, food, a mountain of iron lying in their dark world, and they are consuming her, atom by atom, ton by ton, drawing the metal out of her hull and her decks and her great frame, and turning it into rust that drifts away into the sea. They have been doing it for over a century, and they are speeding up. When researchers returned to the wreck after years away, they found her changed. Visibly, dramatically changed. The crow's nest, where Frederick Fleet had stood straining into the dark without his binoculars, was gone, consumed. Sections of the deck had collapsed. The captain's quarters had begun to fall away. The famous places, the recognizable features, the parts that made her still look like a ship, they are dissolving, deck by deck, into the mud. The scientists who study her now speak in terms that are almost unbearable in their finality. They estimate that within a matter of decades, within the lifetime of people alive today, perhaps within the lifetime of a child being born this year, the recognizable structure of the Titanic will be gone entirely. The hull will collapse. The bow that still looks like the front of a great ship will sag and crumble and sink into the seafloor. And the bacteria will keep eating until there is nothing left but a stain in the mud, a scattering of the things the sea cannot consume, the brass, the bronze, the porcelain, the leather of the shoes, lying in the dark where the greatest ship in the world used to be. She is dying a second time. The first death took 2 hours and 40 minutes. This one is taking a century, but it is just as certain, and it is nearly complete. The Titanic, which was lost and then found, is now being lost again, this time forever, this time beyond any hope of finding. We are the last generations of human beings who will ever be able to look upon her and see a ship. After us, there will be only the photographs and the memory and the names. And the sea is not finished taking lives over her, even now, even more than a century later, because the Titanic still draws people toward her, down into the dark, the way she drew them across the ocean in the first place, with the promise of something magnificent and the quiet, fatal assumption of safety. In the summer of 2023, a small submersible set out to carry a handful of people down to the wreck. The deep ocean, where the Titanic lies, is one of the most hostile environments human beings have ever tried to enter. 2.5 miles down, in darkness absolute, under a pressure so immense that it is difficult even to describe. The weight of all that water pressing in on every surface with a force that would crush a person to nothing in an instant. To go down there is to gamble your life against the same indifferent ocean that took the Titanic in the first place. And there had been warnings about that particular vessel. Experts had raised concerns. Cautions had been voiced about its design, about whether it was truly safe to take human beings to that depth in a craft built the way it was built. The warnings, as warnings so often are in this story, were set aside. The confidence held. The vessel went down. And somewhere on its way to the Titanic, in the cold and the dark, far below the surface, it imploded. All 5 people aboard were killed instantly. They had been traveling to look upon the most famous shipwreck in the world, the great monument to the dangers of certainty, the great memorial to the price of believing yourself beyond the reach of the sea. And the sea took them too, on the way to her, more than a century after she had gone down, in almost exactly the same way and for almost exactly the same reasons. Confidence, the dismissal of warnings, the assumption that the technology of a modern age had made the old dangers obsolete.
It is a haunting thing. Almost too neat. Almost too cruel to be real. The Titanic is a story about what happens when human beings convince themselves they have conquered the sea. And the most recent chapter of that story is 5 more people who went down to visit her grave, certain they were safe, and joined her in the dark. The lesson she has been trying to teach for over 100 years is, apparently, still not learned. Perhaps it never will be. Perhaps it cannot be. Perhaps it is simply in our nature to build the unsinkable thing and to step aboard it and to believe. The iceberg that killed the Titanic broke off from a glacier in Greenland and drifted south for years to keep its appointment on one specific night. And in a sense, that appointment never ended. The Titanic is still keeping it. She is still out there in the dark, 2.5 miles down, dissolving slowly into the sea. And she is still, even now, pulling people toward her, still teaching the same lesson in the same cold water, still reminding anyone who comes near her of the one thing the age that built her could not bring itself to believe: that the sea is patient, that the sea is older than all of us, and that the sea always, always gets the last word. So let us go back now to the beginning, to the smallest thing, to the brass key. When the Titanic left Belfast for Southampton, an officer named David Blair was aboard. He had been assigned to her as second officer, and he had spent those early days learning her, walking her decks, finding where everything was kept. And among the things he knew, because it had fallen to him to know it, was where the key was kept to a particular locker up in the crow's nest, a small cabinet that held the binoculars meant for the lookouts. But at the last moment, in Southampton, the crew was reshuffled. A more experienced officer was brought in above the others. Everyone below him shifted down a rung, and David Blair, bumped from the Voyage, packed his things and walked off the ship before she sailed. And in the rush of leaving, in the small chaos of a man gathering his life and stepping off a vessel he would now never sail on, he forgot one thing. He forgot to hand over the key. He carried it off the Titanic in his pocket, and he carried it home, and the locker in the crow's nest stayed locked, and the binoculars stayed inside it, in the dark, behind a door that no one on board could open. And so, on the night of the 14th of April, when Frederick Fleet climbed up into the crow's nest and stood there in the bitter, windless cold, straining his eyes into a moonless dark over a sea so flat it gave nothing away, he was doing it with his bare eyes. The glasses that might have let him see a little farther, resolve a little sooner that smudge of deeper black on the black horizon, were locked in a cabinet a few feet away, and the key to that cabinet was in a coat pocket in England, in the home of a man who was not even aboard. Fleet would say, afterward, asked directly whether binoculars would have made a difference, that he believed they would, that he might have seen it sooner, and sooner on that night meant everything. Sooner meant seconds. And seconds, that night, were the whole of it. 37 seconds. That is the figure that comes back again and again to anyone who studies this. The time, by the best reconstructions, between the moment Fleet rang the bell and called down the warning and the moment the iceberg touched the hull. 37 seconds in which the great machine of the ship and the men who ran her did everything they could, and turned her, and very nearly made it, came so close to making it that the iceberg only brushed her, only kissed her below the waterline, a glancing wound that opened her up along just enough of her length to doom her by the narrowest of margins. A little sooner, and she steers clear entirely and steams on into the night and the morning and into a history where nobody ever learns her name. A little later, and she strikes head on, crumples her bow, floods 2 compartments, 3 at most, and limps into New York, battered and afloat. And again, nobody learns her name. It was the in-between that killed her. The almost. The 37 seconds that were just enough to nearly save her, and not quite. And that is the thing about this story that will not let a person go. It is not a story of one great mistake. There is no single villain in it, no one monstrous act of negligence on which to hang the whole catastrophe and feel, having hung it, that the world makes sense. There is only the key, forgotten in a pocket, and the warning set politely aside, and the lifeboats, too few, because the law had not caught up to the size of the ship, and the bulkheads, built just a little too low, because building them higher would have cost a little more and inconvenienced the first-class passengers a little more. And the speed, kept high, because slowing down felt unnecessary on a calm, clear night in a ship that could not sink. And the lookout straining with naked eyes. And the wireless operator, exhausted, brushing off the final warning so he could clear a backlog of cheerful telegrams about the weather and the journey and when to send the car round. And the ship, a few miles off, her radio switched off for the night, her crew asleep, her watch standing on her cold deck watching rockets climb into the sky and deciding they must be nothing, must be some private celebration, no cause for alarm. Pull any one of those threads out of the weave and the whole thing comes undone. Hand over the key and Fleet has his glasses. Slow the ship and the 37 seconds become 50, become a clean miss. Build the bulkheads 3 meters higher and 5 flooded compartments are survivable, and Thomas Andrews comes up from his inspection and says, gravely, that it will be a long, cold, uncomfortable night, but that she will float until help arrives. Put enough boats on her davits and the arithmetic of that night is not a death sentence for 2/3 of the people aboard, but an inconvenience, a frightening story they tell at dinner parties for the rest of their long lives. Any one of those things, just one, and the Titanic becomes a footnote, a near miss, a ship that had a bad night once and was fine. It took all of them. It took every single small ordinary failure lining up in a row, each one defensible on its own, each one the kind of thing that happens 1,000 times and comes to nothing. It took all of them falling into place together, on the same night, in the same dark water, to make the thing we still cannot stop talking about more than a century later. None of it had to happen. That is the sentence that sits underneath the whole story like cold water under ice. None of it had to happen. Every link in the chain could have been otherwise. And that is precisely why it haunts us. Because a disaster that could not have been avoided is a tragedy. But it is a clean one, an act of God, a thing to mourn and then release. A disaster that did not have to happen, that was assembled out of a dozen small human choices, any one of which could have gone the other way. That is something else. That is a mirror. And what it shows us, when we are honest enough to look, is not a story about a ship at all. Because the Titanic was never really about the ship. We remember her, and we keep remembering her, out of all the disasters of history. Disasters that killed more people, disasters that were crueler, disasters that reshaped the world more violently than the sinking of one ocean liner ever did. There are catastrophes from those same years with death tolls many times higher that almost no one outside a history book could name. But everyone knows the Titanic. A child knows the Titanic. The name has become a word in itself, a thing you can call any doomed enterprise, any proud venture sailing confidently toward a fate it refuses to see. And the reason is not the scale of it. The reason is what she meant. The reason is that she was not just a ship, but a symbol, the proudest, most perfect expression of an entire age's faith in itself. And when she went down, that faith went down with her. And somewhere in our bones, we have never stopped feeling the size of what was lost in those 2 hours and 40 minutes. She was built by an age that believed, sincerely and completely, that the human story was a story of progress without end, that each year would be better than the last, each machine grander than the one before, each problem solved and never to trouble us again. They had conquered distance with the railway and the telegraph. They had conquered the night with electric light. They had conquered the sky very nearly in those same years. And they were, they believed, in the final stages of conquering the sea, the oldest enemy,
the one that had drowned sailors since before there was history to record it. The Titanic was the proof. The Titanic was the age looking at the ocean and saying, "We are done being afraid of you. We have built a thing you cannot touch." And the ocean listened and waited, the way it always waits. And on a calm, clear night, with the stars very bright and the water very still, it answered. She sank in April of 1912, and 2 years and a few months later, in the summer of 1914, the same civilization that had built her, the same confident, gilded, technologically intoxicated Europe, walked itself into a war that it was equally certain would be short and glorious and over by Christmas. They marched off to it with flowers in their rifle barrels, and the same unshakable faith in their own machines and their own progress and their own invincibility that had launched the Titanic down the slipway at Belfast. And the machines they had built? The same brilliant, modern, unsinkable machines turned the fields of Europe into a slaughterhouse on a scale the human race had never imagined, and burned the old, confident world to ash, and ended forever the age that thought it had conquered everything. Historians have called the Titanic the first crack in that world, the first quiet, almost unnoticed signal that the great machine of progress did not, in fact, run only forward, that all the cleverness in the world could be undone in a single cold night by a single piece of floating ice and a forgotten key and 37 seconds. She was the warning before the catastrophe, and nobody read her in time, because nobody ever does. That is why she stays with us. Not because of how many died, though they did die, in numbers that should never be allowed to shrink into a statistic, but because she is the perfect, terrible parable of the one thing human beings cannot seem to learn, no matter how many times we are taught it, that the moment we are most certain we are safe is the precise moment we are in the most danger. That hubris does not announce itself. It does not feel like arrogance from the inside. From the inside, it feels like confidence. It feels like progress. It feels like standing on the deck of the largest, most beautiful, most advanced moving object ever built by human hands, on a clear and starlit night, and feeling, in your chest, the simple, unquestioned certainty that nothing bad can happen here. That is what hubris feels like. It feels like the Titanic the night before. But I do not want to leave her there. Because to make the Titanic only a lesson, only a parable, only a warning, only a symbol of an age, is to do to the people aboard her something almost as cold as what the sea did. It is to forget that they were people. And in the end, when everything else about her has been argued over and explained and turned into a moral, it is the people who remain. It is the people who are the reason any of it matters at all. So let us remember them, not as a death toll, not as the 1500, as the men and women and children they actually were on the actual nights of their actual lives, before the water closed over them. Remember Isidore and Ida Strauss, married for more than 4 decades, who had built a life together out of nothing, and were old now, and tired, and content. Remember that when the boats were being filled and Ida was offered a seat, she stepped back out of it, that she would not be parted from the man she had spent her whole life beside, that she gave her warm coat to her maid and put her into the boat in her place, and then went and stood with her husband on the deck of the sinking ship, and the last anyone saw of them, they were sitting together, quietly, holding each other, waiting. "Where you go," she had told him, "I go." And she meant it, all the way down. Remember Benjamin Guggenheim, who understood, with a clarity that came over many of them in that last hour, that he was not going to live, and who went back to his cabin and took off the heavy sweater someone had pressed on him, and dressed himself instead in his finest evening clothes, white tie and tails, and came back up onto the deck dressed as though for dinner. "We have dressed in our best," he said, "and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." And he asked, if there was a chance, that someone carry word to his wife that he had done his duty, that no woman had been left aboard because Benjamin Guggenheim had taken her place in a boat, And then he sat down in a deck chair, in his evening clothes, with a glass in his hand, and waited for the sea.
Remember John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship, who placed his young, pregnant wife into a lifeboat and asked if he might join her given her condition and was told, no, only women and children. And who did not argue, and did not pull rank, and did not buy or bully his way past the rule, who simply stepped back from the boat and lit a cigarette and told her he would see her in New York, and stood on the deck and watched her lowered away into the dark. His body was recovered from the sea. Hers was not aboard to recover. She lived, and months later their son was born into a world his father never saw. Remember the band. Remember Wallace Hartley and the 7 musicians who, when it became clear what was happening, did not run, did not fight for the boats, did not save themselves, who took up their instruments instead, on the slanting deck, in the cold, and played. Who played to give the people something to hold on to in the chaos, something steady in the tilting dark, and who kept playing as the deck tilted further and the water climbed, and were still playing, by every account, near the very end. Not one of them survived. They are among the most quietly extraordinary people in the whole of this story. Ordinary working musicians who, given the choice between saving their own lives and easing the deaths of strangers, chose the strangers and played them out of the world. And remember the ones whose names we will never know as well as those. Remember the engineers and the firemen and the trimmers, down in the heat and the dark of the engine and boiler rooms at the very bottom of the ship, the place the water reached first and worst. Remember that they stayed at their posts, that they kept the lights burning and the pumps running and the wireless powered long after they must have known what staying would cost them, so that up above, in the cold air, the people they would never meet could see to find the boats, and the operators could keep tapping out the call for help into the night. The lights of the Titanic burned almost to the very end. They burned because men stood in the rising water at the bottom of the ship and would not leave the engines. And then the lights went out, all at once, and we may be sure that the men who had kept them burning went with them. And remember the children. Remember that in the third-class decks, far below, behind the gates and the locked passages and the maze of unfamiliar corridors, there were whole families, emigrant families, people who had sold everything they owned and crossed half a continent to reach this ship. People who were sailing toward a new life in a new country with everything they had left in the world packed into a single trunk. Remember the Goodwin family, 2 parents and 6 children, the youngest a baby. Not one of them survived. Every member of that family died that night. And for years afterward, there was a small body recovered from the sea that no one could identify, a little child, buried under a stone that simply read, "The unknown child," mourned by strangers because there was no one left of his own family to mourn him, until, a very long time later, the patient work of science gave him back his name, and he was found to be the youngest of the Goodwins, the baby, 19 months old. They had all gone down together, the whole family, reaching for America, and the sea took every one of them, and it was a very long time before the world even knew the baby's name. And remember too the ones who lived, because surviving the Titanic was its own kind of life sentence, and the people who came up out of that night carried it with them for all their remaining years. Remember Margaret Brown, the one the world would later call the unsinkable Molly Brown, who got into a boat and then spent the rest of that long freezing night refusing to behave the way a frightened woman was supposed to behave, who took an oar herself, who argued with the crewman in charge of her lifeboat, who wanted to row away and stay away, and who insisted, fought him, by some accounts threatened to throw him overboard, that they turn back toward the cries in the water and pull someone, anyone, out of the cold while there was still time. She kept the women in her boat rowing partly to save whoever they could, and partly simply to keep them warm and alive and from freezing to death where they sat. She wrapped the shivering in her own furs, and when it was over, she used her name and her money to help the survivors who had lost everything, the third-class passengers who had reached America with nothing but the clothes the sea had left them. She became, afterward, a kind of legend, but the legend was built on something real, on a woman who, in the worst night imaginable, simply refused to look away from the people who needed her. Remember the Countess of Rothes, a titled lady of the first class who, when her lifeboat was lowered, took the tiller and steered it through the dark for hours, and rowed, and comforted the frightened, and was remembered ever after by the crewmen beside her as one of the steadiest hands he had known on any boat in any sea. The disaster stripped away, for one night, all the careful distinctions the age had built between people, and revealed, underneath, who they actually were. Some men in evening dress behaved like cowards, some titled ladies rowed like sailors, some of the poorest people aboard gave up their own slim chances for strangers. The water did not care about any of it. The water only revealed. Remember Thomas Andrews, the man who had designed her, who knew her better than any soul aboard, who had walked her decks with a notebook making lists of small improvements right up until the night she died. It was Andrews who made the inspection after the collision, who looked at the water rising in the forward compartments and did the arithmetic in his head and understood, before almost anyone else on board, that his ship, the thing he had built, the thing he loved, was going to sink, and that there were nowhere near enough boats. He spent the time he had left moving through the ship, urging people toward the deck, toward the boats, pressing life belts on those who had not put them on, telling people not to wait. And then, near the end, he was seen alone in the first-class smoking room, standing before the great painting that hung over the fireplace, a painting of a ship coming safely into a calm harbor, his life belt off, just standing there, looking at the painting of the safe harbor his own ship would never reach. That is the last anyone saw of Thomas Andrews, a man looking at a picture of the thing he could not give the people he had tried so hard to keep alive. And remember the captain, Edward Smith, the most experienced and most trusted commander in the entire White Star Fleet, the man they called the millionaire's captain because the wealthy would book their passage around his schedule. This was to have been his last voyage, one final crossing, the crown on a long and spotless career, and then a quiet retirement. He had said, years before, that he could not imagine any condition that would cause a modern ship to founder, that shipbuilding had gone beyond that. And now he stood on the bridge of the largest ship ever built, on the last voyage of his life, and watched his certainty come apart in his hands. What he did in those final hours has been argued over ever since, whether he froze, whether he gave the orders he should have, whether a sharper man might have saved more. But the simplest account is the one most often given, that he was last seen on or near his bridge, going down with his ship as the water came up to meet him. A man who had spent 40 years mastering the sea and learned in one night that it had never been mastered at all. And remember the ones who lived and wished sometimes that they had not. Because that was the other thing the Titanic handed out, along with the cold and the grief. The long gray weight of having survived when so many did not. There were people pulled from the water and the boats who spent the rest of their lives unable to bear the sound of a band, or the sight of calm water under stars, or the cold. Mothers who had been put into boats while their husbands stepped back. Children who grew up with the memory, never quite articulated, of a night of screaming in the dark and a parent who did not come home. And there was Bruce Ismay, the managing director, the man whose company had built her and whose pressure may have helped keep her steaming fast through the ice, who found a place in a collapsible boat in the final minutes and lived. He survived. And surviving destroyed him. The press of two nations turned on him with a fury that has rarely been equaled, branding him a coward who had saved himself while women and children died. And whether or not that was fair, and there are arguments on both sides of it that have never been settled, he carried it for the rest of his days. He lived another quarter of a century, withdrawn, diminished, a man who had stepped off the deck of the sinking Titanic and never, in any way that mattered, gotten off her at all.
These are the people, not symbols, not a lesson. People with names and faces and lives that had been going on for years before that night and that should have gone on for years after it. People who packed their bags and kissed their families and stepped aboard the safest ship in the world, certain,
the way we are all certain when we board the safe and ordinary machines of our own lives that they would step off again at the other end. And the deepest, hardest truth of the Titanic is not the hubris of the age that built her. It is the ordinariness of the people who died on her. They were not fools. They were not reckless. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply trusted the world they lived in, trusted that the experts knew what they were doing, that the ship was what they had been told it was, that the warnings, if there were any that mattered, would have been heeded by someone whose job it was to heed them. They trusted the system. And the system, assembled out of 100 small, ordinary failures, let them down into the cold. And here is what remains of them now. Not the ship. The ship is dissolving, and within the lifetimes of children alive today, there will be nothing left of her on the seafloor but a stain in the mud and a scattering of the things the sea cannot eat. Not their bodies. The bodies are long gone, returned to the ocean decades ago, no trace of them remaining in all that cold, dark water. What remains down there, in the place where the greatest ship in the world used to be, is the shoes. Pairs of them, lying side by side in the mud, 2.5 miles down, in the dark, where they have lain for over a century. A pair of boots, a smaller pair beside a larger pair, the exact shape and position of where a human being lay down in the deepest grave on earth and did not get up. The bodies are gone, but the shoes remember where they were. The leather holds the shape of the absence. And those shoes are the truest headstones in the world, not because they tell us anything about the dead, but because they are the last physical proof that the dead were ever really there at all, that this was not a parable, that these were not symbols, that 2,200 actual human beings stepped onto an actual ship one spring morning, and that 1,500 of them are still down there, marked now by nothing in all the world but their shoes. We will lose even that in time. The sea is patient, and the sea is thorough. And one day, the shoes too will be gone, and the wreck will be gone, and there will be no physical thing left anywhere on the earth to say that the Titanic was real. And on that day, the only place she will exist will be the place she has really lived all along, in the telling, in the remembering. In the stories passed from one generation to the next, the names spoken aloud, the band that played, the old couple who would not be parted, the man in his evening clothes, the children reaching for America, the lights that burned to the end because men in the dark refused to leave the engines. As long as those stories are told, the people on the Titanic are not entirely gone. They live in the only thing that has ever truly outlasted steel or ice, or even the patient sea itself. They live in memory. And memory, fragile as it seems, has turned out to be the most durable thing the human race has ever made. The ship is dissolving, the shoes will follow, but the story, if we keep telling it, does not rust. It is very quiet where she lies. 2.5 miles down there is no light, and there has never been any light, and there never will be. There is no sound but the faint settling of a great structure slowly giving itself back to the sea. The currents move through her empty corridors the way they have moved for over 100 years, slow and cold and indifferent. The rusticles hang from her railings and drink her iron, atom by atom, in no hurry at all. The great anchors that men shouted and sweated to forge still hang at her bow, pointing the way she was always going, down into the dark. And the porcelain dishes, stamped with the proud white star, still lie in their neat rows in the mud, set as if for a dinner that the cold and the dark and the years will never quite get around to serving. Somewhere up above, 2.5 miles up, the surface of the North Atlantic rolls on under the sky exactly as it did on the night she went down. The same stars come out over the same black water. The icebergs still calve from the glaciers of Greenland and still drift south, year after year, century after century, on their slow, patient errands across the shipping lanes, though now there are people whose whole job is to watch for them, to track them, to send out the warnings, because of one night in 1912 when no one was watching closely enough. The sea has not changed at all.
The sea does not remember the Titanic. The sea does not remember anything. That is the whole of its terrible power, that it is older than memory, older than us, and it will be here, rolling on under the stars, long after the last person who ever heard the name Titanic has joined her in the silence. We were so sure. That is the thing to carry away from her, into whatever ship of our own we are standing on tonight, certain of our safety. We were so sure. We had built the unsinkable thing, and we had stepped aboard it, and we had felt in our chests that simple, unquestioned certainty that nothing bad could happen here. And the certainty itself was the danger. The certainty was the iceberg. The certainty was the part we never saw coming because we had decided in advance that there was nothing left to see. The Titanic did not sink because the sea was cruel. The sea is not cruel. The sea is only patient. The Titanic sank because the people who built her and sailed her forgot, for one fatal stretch of calm, clear nights, the oldest piece of wisdom there is, that the world is older and larger and stranger than our confidence in it, and that it does not care, in the slightest, how sure we are. And so she lies there still, in the dark, dissolving, keeping the appointment the iceberg made for her on a night when the stars were very bright. The proudest thing an age ever built, brought down by the smallest things, a forgotten key, a few missing seconds, a warning set politely aside, a confidence that felt exactly like wisdom right up until the moment the water came in. She was the dream of a century that believed it had conquered everything, and she is the proof, lying 2.5 miles down in the cold and the silence, that it had conquered nothing at all. The lights are out now. The band has stopped playing. The cries that filled the dark have long since faded into the long silence that always, in the end, comes after. The names are growing faint. The ship is going back, slowly, to the sea that was always going to take her. And one day, not so very far from now, there will be nothing left of the Titanic at all. Nothing but the story, and the stars she sank beneath, and the patient, ancient, indifferent water that closed over her and smoothed itself flat again, as if she had never been there at all. She was there. For a few short years, she was the most magnificent thing in the world, and for 2 hours and 40 minutes, she was the saddest. And then she was gone. Remember her. Remember them. Remember that none of it had to happen, and that all of it did, and that the only thing we can carry up out of that cold water is the willingness to be a little less certain, and to listen a little more closely the next time someone tells us the warnings can wait. The sea has the last word now. It always did. And this, the unsinkable ship, the Gilded Age, the 1,500 souls still waiting in the dark, and the long silence that closed over them all. This was one of history's last chapters.